Chapter 50 of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Rough wintry traveling, hills and plains, snow and ice, disappearance of game, a vast dreary plain, a second halt for the winter, another wigwam, New Year's feast, buffalo humps, tongues and marrow bones, return of spring, launch of canoes, bad navigation, pedestrian march, vast prairies, deserted camps, Pawnee squaws, an Oto Indian, news of war, voyage down the Platte and the Missouri, reception at Fort Osage, arrival at St. Louis. The interval of comfort and repose which the party had enjoyed in their wigwam rendered the renewal of their fatigues intolerable for the first 2 or 3 days. The snow lay deep and was slightly frozen on the surface, but not sufficiently to bear their weight. Their feet became sore by breaking through the crust, and their limbs weary by floundering on without firm foothold. So exhausted and dispirited were they that they began to think it would be better to remain and run the risk of being killed by the Indians than to drag on thus painfully, with the probability of perishing by the way. Their miserable horse fared no better than themselves, having for the first day or two no other fodder than the ends of willow twigs and the bark of the cottonwood tree. They all, however, appeared to gain patience and hardihood as they proceeded, and for 14 days kept steadily on, making a distance of about 330 miles. For some days the range of mountains which had been near to their wigwam kept parallel to the river at no great distance, but at length subsided into hills. Sometimes they found the river bordered with alluvial bottoms and groves with cottonwood and willows. Sometimes the adjacent country was naked and barren. In one place it ran for a considerable distance between rocky hills and promontories covered with cedar and pitch pines and peopled with the bighorn and the mountain deer. At other places it wandered through prairies well stocked with buffaloes and antelopes. As they descended the course of the river, they began to perceive the ash and white oak here and there among the cottonwood and willow, and at length caught a sight of some wild horses on the distant prairies. The weather was various. At one time the snow lay deep. Then they had a genial day or two with the mildness and serenity of autumn. Then again the frost was so severe that the river was sufficiently frozen to bear them upon the ice. During the last 3 days of their fortnight's travel, however, the face of the country changed. The timber gradually diminished until they could scarcely find fuel sufficient for culinary purposes. The game grew more and more scanty, and finally none were to be seen but a few miserable, broken-down buffalo bulls not worth killing. The snow lay 15 inches deep and made the traveling grievously painful and toilsome. At length they came to an immense plain where no vestige of timber was to be seen, nor a single quadruped to enliven the desolate landscape. Here, then, their hearts failed them, and they held another consultation. The width of the river, which was upwards of a mile, its extreme shallowness, the frequency of quicksands, and various other characteristics, had at length made them sensible of their errors with respect to it, and they now came to the correct conclusion that they were on the banks of the Platte, or shallow river. What were they to do? Pursue its course to the Missouri? To go on at this season of the year seemed dangerous in the extreme. There was no prospect of obtaining either food or firing. The country was destitute of trees, and though there might be driftwood along the river, it lay too deep beneath the snow for them to find it. The weather was threatening a change, and a snowstorm on these boundless wastes might prove as fatal as a whirlwind of sand on an Arabian desert. After much dreary deliberation, it was at length determined to retrace their last 3 days' journey of 77 miles to a place which they had remarked where there was a sheltering grove of forest trees, and a country abundant in game. Here they would once more set up their winter quarters and await the opening of the navigation to launch themselves in canoes. Accordingly, on the 27th of December, they faced about, retraced their steps, and on the 30th regained the part of the river in question. Here the alluvial bottom was from 1 to 2 miles wide and thickly covered with a forest of cottonwood trees, while herds of buffalo were scattered about the neighboring prairie, several of which soon fell beneath their rifles. They encamped on the margin of the river in a grove where there were trees large enough for canoes. Here they put up a shed for immediate shelter and immediately proceeded to erect a hut. New Year's Day dawned when, as yet, but one wall of their cabin was completed. The genial and jovial day, however, was not permitted to pass uncelebrated, even by this weather-beaten crew of wanderers. All work was suspended, except that of roasting and boiling. The choicest of the buffalo meat, with tongues and humps and marrow bones, were devoured in quantities that would astonish anyone that has not lived among hunters or Indians. And, as an extra regale, having no tobacco left, they cut up an old tobacco pouch, still redolent with the potent herb, and smoked it in honor of the day. Thus, for a time, in present revelry, however uncouth, they forgot all past troubles and all anxieties about the future, and their forlorn wigwam echoed to the sound of gaiety. The next day they resumed their labors, and by the 6th of the month it was complete. They soon killed abundance of buffalo and again laid in a stock of winter provisions. The party were more fortunate in this, their second cantonment. The winter passed away without any Indian visitors, and the game continued to be plenty in the neighborhood. They felled 2 large trees and shaped them into canoes, and as the spring opened and thaw of several days' continuance melted the ice in the river, they made every preparation for embarking. On the 8th of March they launched forth in their canoes, but soon found that the river had not depth sufficient even for such slender barks. It expanded into a wide but extremely shallow stream, with many sandbars, and occasionally various channels. They got one of their canoes a few miles down it with extreme difficulty, sometimes wading and dragging it over the shoals. At length they had to abandon the attempt, and to resume their journey on foot, aided by their faithful old pack-horse, who had recruited strength during the repose of the winter. The weather delayed them for a few days, having suddenly become more rigorous than it had been at any time during the winter. But on the 20th of March they were again on their journey. In 2 days they arrived at the vast naked prairie, the wintry aspect of which had caused them in December to pause and turn back. It was now clothed in the early verdure of spring, and plentifully stocked with game. Still, when obliged to bivouac on its bare surface without any shelter and by a scanty fire of dry buffalo dung, they found the night blasts piercing cold. On one occasion, a herd of buffalo straying near their evening camp, they killed 3 of them merely for their hides, wherewith to make a shelter for the night. They continued on for upwards of 100 miles, with vast prairies extending before them as they advanced, sometimes diversified by undulating hills, but destitute of trees. In one place they saw a gang of 65 wild horses, but as to the buffaloes, they seemed absolutely to cover the country. Wild geese abounded, and they passed extensive swamps that were alive with innumerable flocks of waterfowl, among which were a few swans, but an endless variety of ducks. The river continued a winding course to the east-northeast, nearly a mile in width, but too shallow to float even an empty canoe. The country spread out into a vast level plain, bounded by the horizon alone, excepting to the north, where a line of hills seemed like a long promontory stretching into the bosom of the ocean. The dreary sameness of the prairie wastes began to grow extremely irksome. The travelers longed for the sight of a forest or grove or single tree to break the level uniformity, and began to notice every object that gave reason to hope they were drawing towards the end of this weary wilderness. Thus, the occurrence of a particular kind of grass was hailed as a proof that they could not be far from the bottoms of the Missouri, and they were rejoiced at putting up several prairie hens, a kind of grouse, seldom found far in the interior. In picking up driftwood for fuel also, they found on some pieces the mark of an axe, which caused much speculation as to the time when and the persons by whom the trees had been felled. Thus they went on, like sailors at sea, who perceive in every floating weed and wandering bird harbingers of the wished-for land. By the close of the month the weather became very mild, and heavily burdened as they were, they found the noontide temperature uncomfortably warm. On the 30th they came to 3 deserted hunting camps, either of Pawnees or Otos, about which were buffalo skulls in all directions, and the frames on which the hides had been stretched and cured. They had apparently been occupied the preceding autumn. For several days they kept patiently on, watching every sign that might give them an idea as to where they were and how near to the banks of the Missouri. Though there were numerous traces of hunting parties and encampments, they were not of recent date. The country seemed deserted. The only human beings they met with were 3 Pawnee squaws in a hut in the midst of a deserted camp. Their people had all gone to the south in pursuit of the buffalo, and had left these poor women behind, being too sick and infirm to travel. It is a common practice with the Pawnees, and probably with other roving tribes, when departing on a distant expedition which will not admit of encumbrance or delay, to leave their aged and infirm with a supply of provisions sufficient for a temporary subsistence. When this is exhausted, they must perish, though sometimes their sufferings are abridged by hostile prowlers who may visit the deserted camp. The poor squaws in question expected some such fate at the hands of the white strangers, and though the latter accosted them in the kindest manner and made them presents of dried buffalo meat, it was impossible to soothe their alarm or get any information from them. The first landmark by which the travelers were enabled to conjecture their position with any degree of confidence was an island about 70 miles in length, which they presumed to be Grand Isle. If so, they were within 140 miles of the Missouri. They kept on, therefore, with renewed spirit, and at the end of 3 days met with an Oto Indian, by whom they were confirmed in their conjecture. They learned at the same time another piece of information of an uncomfortable nature. According to his account, there was war between the United States and England, and in fact it had existed for a whole year, during which time they had been beyond the reach of all knowledge of the affairs of the civilized world. The Oto conducted the travelers to his village, situated a short distance from the banks of the Platte. Here they were delighted to meet with 2 white men, Messrs. Dornan and Roy, Indian traders recently from St. Louis. Of these they had 1,000 inquiries to make concerning all affairs, foreign and domestic, during their year of sepulture in the wilderness, and especially about the events of the existing war. They now prepared to abandon their weary travel by land and to embark upon the water. A bargain was made with Mr. Dornan, who engaged to furnish them with a canoe and provisions for the voyage, in exchange for their venerable and well-tried fellow-traveler, the old snake horse. Accordingly, in a couple of days, the Indians employed by that gentleman constructed for them a canoe 20 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 18 inches deep. The frame was of poles and willow twigs, on which were stretched 5 elk and buffalo hides, sewed together with sinews, and the seams paid with unctuous mud. In this they embarked at an early hour on the 16th of April, and drifted down 10 miles with the stream, when the wind being high they encamped, and set to work to make oars, which they had not been able to procure at the Indian village. Once more afloat, they went merrily down the stream, and after making 35 miles, emerged into the broad, turbid current of the Missouri. Here they were borne along briskly by the rapid stream, though by the time their fragile bark had floated a couple of 100 miles, its frame began to show the effects of the voyage. Luckily, they came to the deserted wintering place of some hunting party, where they found 2 old wooden canoes. Taking possession of the largest, they again committed themselves to the current, and after dropping down 55 miles further, arrived safely at Fort Osage. Here they found Lieutenant Brownson still in command, the officer who had given the expedition a hospitable reception on its way up the river 18 months previously. He received this remnant of the party with a cordial welcome, and endeavored in every way to promote their comfort and enjoyment during their sojourn at the fort. The greatest luxury they met with on their return to the abode of civilized man was bread, not having tasted any for nearly a year. Their stay at Fort Osage was but short. On re-embarking, they were furnished with an ample supply of provisions by the kindness of Lieutenant Brownson, and performed the rest of their voyage without adverse circumstance. On the 30th of April, they arrived in perfect health and fine spirits at St. Louis, having been 10 months in performing this perilous expedition from Astoria. Their return caused quite a sensation at the place, bringing the first intelligence of the fortune of Mr. Hunt and his party in their adventurous route across the Rocky Mountains, and of the new establishment on the shores of the Pacific. End of Chapter 50. Chapter 51 of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Agreement between Mr. Astor and the Russian Fur Company. War between the United States and Great Britain. Instructions to Captain Soul of the Beaver. Fitting out of the Lark. News of the arrival of Mr. Stuart. It is now necessary, in linking together the parts of this excursive narrative, that we notice the proceedings of Mr. Astor in support of his great undertaking. His project with respect to the Russian establishments along the northwest coast had been diligently prosecuted. The agent sent by him to St. Petersburg to negotiate in his name as president of the American Fur Company had, under sanction of the Russian government, made a provisional agreement with the Russian company. By this agreement, which was ratified by Mr. Astor in 1813, the 2 companies bound themselves not to interfere with each other's trading and hunting grounds, nor to furnish arms and ammunition to the Indians. They were to act in concert also against all interlopers, and to succor each other in case of danger. The American company was to have the exclusive right of supplying the Russian posts with goods and necessaries, receiving peltries in payment at stated prices. They were also, if so requested by the Russian governor, to convey the furs of the Russian company to Canton, sell them on commission, and bring back the proceeds at such freight as might be agreed on at the time. This agreement was to continue in operation 4 years, and to be renewable for a similar term, unless some unforeseen contingency should render a modification necessary. It was calculated to be of great service to the infant establishment at Astoria, dispelling the fears of hostile rivalry on the part of the foreign companies in its neighborhood, and giving a formidable blow to the irregular trade along the coast. It was also the intention of Mr. Astor to have coasting vessels of his own at Astoria, of small tonnage and draught of water, fitted for coasting service. These, having a place of shelter and deposit, could ply about the coast in short voyages in favorable weather, and would have vast advantage over chance ships, which must make long voyages, maintain numerous crews, and could only approach the coast at certain seasons of the year. He hoped, therefore, gradually to make Astoria the great emporium of the American fur trade in the Pacific, and the nucleus of a powerful American state. Unfortunately for these sanguine anticipations, before Mr. Astor had ratified the agreement, as above stated, war broke out between the United States and Great Britain. He perceived at once the peril of the case. The harbor of New York would doubtless be blockaded, and the departure of the annual supply ship in the autumn prevented. Or, if she should succeed in getting out to sea, she might be captured on her voyage. In this emergency, he wrote to Captain Soule, commander of the Beaver. The letter, which was addressed to him at Canton, directed him to proceed to the factory at the mouth of the Columbia with such articles as the establishment might need, and to remain there, subject to the orders of Mr. Hunt, should that gentleman be in command there. The war continued. No tidings had yet been received from Astoria, the dispatches having been delayed by the misadventure of Mr. Reed at the Falls of the Columbia, and the unhorsing of Mr. Stuart by the crows among the mountains. A painful uncertainty also prevailed about Mr. Hunt and his party. Nothing had been heard of them since their departure from the Arikara village. Lisa, who parted from them there, had predicted their destruction, and some of the traders of the Northwest Company had actually spread a rumor of their having been cut off by the Indians. It was a hard trial of the courage and means of an individual to have to fit out another costly expedition where so much had already been expended, so much uncertainty prevailed, and where the risk of loss was so greatly enhanced that no insurance could be effected. In spite of all these discouragements, Mr. Astor determined to send another ship to the relief of the settlement. He selected for this purpose a vessel called the Lark, remarkable for her fast sailing. The disordered state of the times, however, caused such a delay that February arrived while the vessel was yet lingering in port. At this juncture, Mr. Astor learnt that the Northwest Company were preparing to send out an armed ship of 20 guns, called the Isaac Todd, to form an establishment at the mouth of the Columbia. These tidings gave him great uneasiness. A considerable proportion of the persons in his employ were Scotchmen and Canadians, and several of them had been in the service of the Northwest Company. Should Mr. Hunt have failed to arrive at Astoria, the whole establishment would be under the control of Mr. McDougall, of whose fidelity he had received very disparaging accounts from Captain Thorne. The British government also might deem it worthwhile to send a force against the establishment, having been urged to do so some time previously by the Northwest Company. Under all these circumstances, Mr. Astor wrote to Mr. Monroe, then Secretary of State, requesting protection from the government of the United States. He represented the importance of his settlement in a commercial point of view, and the shelter it might afford to the American vessels in those seas. All he asked was that the American government would throw 40 or 50 men into the fort at his establishment, which would be sufficient for its defense until he could send reinforcements overland. He waited in vain for a reply to this letter, the government, no doubt, being engrossed at the time by an overwhelming crowd of affairs. The month of March arrived, and the Lark was ordered by Mr. Astor to put to sea. The officer who was to command her shrunk from his engagement, and in the exigency of the moment she was given in charge to Mr. Northrop, the mate. Mr. Nicholas G. Ogden, a gentleman on whose talents and integrity the highest reliance could be placed, sailed as supercargo. The Lark put to sea in the beginning of March, 1813. By this opportunity, Mr. Astor wrote to Mr. Hunt as head of the establishment at the mouth of the Columbia, for he would not allow himself to doubt of his welfare. "I always think you are well," said he, "and that I shall see you again, which Heaven, I hope, will grant." He warned him to be on his guard against any attempts to surprise the post, suggesting the probability of armed hostility on the part of the Northwest Company, and expressing his indignation at the ungrateful returns made by that association for his frank and open conduct and advantageous overtures. "Were I on the spot," said he, and had the management of affairs, I would defy them all. But as it is, everything depends upon you and your friends about you. Our enterprise is grand and deserves success, and I hope in God it will meet it. If my object was merely gain of money, I should say, think whether it is best to save what we can and abandon the place. But the very idea is like a dagger to my heart." This extract is sufficient to show the spirit and the views which actuated Mr. Astor in this great undertaking. Week after week and month after month elapsed without anything to dispel the painful incertitude that hung over every part of this enterprise. Though a man of resolute spirit and not easily cast down, the dangers impending over this darling scheme of his ambition had a gradual effect upon the spirits of Mr. Astor. He was sitting one gloomy evening by his window, revolving over the loss of the Tonquin and the fate of her unfortunate crew, and fearing that some equally tragical calamity might have befallen the adventurers across the mountains, when the evening newspaper was brought to him. The first paragraph that caught his eye announced the arrival of Mr. Stuart and his party at St. Louis, with intelligence that Mr. Hunt and his companions had effected their perilous expedition to the mouth of the Columbia. This was a gleam of sunshine that for a time dispelled every cloud, and he now looked forward with sanguine hope to the accomplishment of all his plans. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains, by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Banks of the Walla Walla. Departure of David Stuart for the Okanagan. Mr. Clark's route up Lewis River. Chippenish, or pierced-nose Indians. Their character, appearance, and habits. Thievish habits. Laying up of the boats. Post at Pointed Heart and Spokane Rivers. Mackenzie, his route up the Camoenum. Bands of traveling Indians. Expedition of Reed to the Caches. Adventures of wandering voyageurs and trappers. The course of our narrative now takes us back to the regions beyond the mountains to dispose of the parties that set out from Astoria in company with Mr. Robert Stuart, and whom he left on the banks of the Walla Walla. Those parties likewise separated from each other shortly after his departure, proceeding to their respective destinations, but agreeing to meet at the mouth of the Walla Walla about the beginning of June in the following year, with such peltries as they should have collected in the winter, so as to convoy each other through the dangerous passes of the Columbia. Mr. David Stuart, one of the partners, proceeded with his men to the post already established by him at the mouth of the Okanagan. Having furnished this with goods and ammunition, he proceeded 300 miles up that river, where he established another post in a good trading neighborhood. Mr. Clark, another partner, conducted his little band up Lewis River to the mouth of a small stream coming in from the north, to which the Canadians gave the name of the Pavillon. Here he found a village or encampment of 40 huts or tents, covered with mats and inhabited by Nez Perces, or pierced-nose Indians, as they are called by the traders, but Chippenish, as they are called by themselves. They are a hardy, laborious, and somewhat knavish race, who lead a precarious life, fishing and digging roots during the summer and autumn, hunting the deer on snowshoes during the winter, and traversing the Rocky Mountains in the spring to trade for buffalo skins with the hunting tribes of the Missouri. In these migrations they are liable to be waylaid and attacked by the Blackfeet and other warlike and predatory tribes, and driven back across the mountains with the loss of their horses and of many of their comrades. A life of this unsettled and precarious kind is apt to render man selfish, and such Mr. Clark found the inhabitants of this village, who were deficient in the usual hospitality of Indians. parting with everything with extreme reluctance, and showing no sensibility to any act of kindness. At the time of his arrival they were all occupied in catching and curing salmon. The men were stout, robust, active, and good-looking, and the women handsomer than those of the tribes nearer to the coast. It was the plan of Mr. Clark to lay up his boats here and proceed by land to his place of destination, which was among the Spokane tribe of Indians, about 150 miles distant. He accordingly endeavored to purchase horses for the journey, but in this he had to contend with the sordid disposition of these people. They asked high prices for their horses, and were so difficult to deal with that Mr. Clark was detained 7 days among them before he could procure a sufficient number. During that time he was annoyed by repeated pilferings, for which he could get no redress. The chief promised to recover the stolen articles, but failed to do so, alleging that the thieves belonged to a distant tribe and had made off with their booty. With this excuse Mr. Clark was fain to content himself, though he laid up in his heart a bitter grudge against the whole pierced-nose race, which it will be found he took occasion subsequently to gratify in a signal manner. Having made arrangements for his departure, Mr. Clark laid up his barge and canoes in a sheltered place on the banks of a small bay, overgrown with shrubs and willows, confiding them to the care of the Nez Perce chief, who, on being promised an ample compensation, engaged to have a guardian eye upon them. Then, mounting his steed and putting himself at the head of his little caravan, he shook the dust off his feet as he turned his back upon this village of rogues and hard dealers. We shall not follow him minutely in his journey, which lay at times over steep and rocky hills, and among crags and precipices, at other times over vast, naked, and sunburnt plains, abounding with rattlesnakes, in traversing which both men and horses suffered intolerably from heat and thirst. The place on which he fixed for a trading post was a fine point of land at the junction of the Pointed Heart and Spokane rivers. His establishment was intended to compete with a trading post of the Northwest Company, situated at no great distance, and to rival it in the trade with the Spokane Indians, as well as with the Kootenays and Flatheads. In this neighborhood we shall leave him for the present. Mr. Mackenzie, who conducted the third party from the Walla Walla, navigated for several days up the south branch of the Columbia, named the Camoenum by the natives, but commonly called Lewis River, in honor of the first explorer. Wandering bands of various tribes were seen along this river, traveling in various directions, for the Indians generally are restless, roving beings, continually intent on enterprises of war, traffic, and hunting. Some of these people were driving large gangs of horses, as if to a distant market. Having arrived at the mouth of the Shahaptan, he ascended some distance up that river and established his trading post upon its banks. This appeared to be a great thoroughfare for the tribes from the neighborhood of the Falls of the Columbia in their expeditions to make war upon the tribes of the Rocky Mountains, to hunt buffalo on the plains beyond, or to traffic for roots and buffalo robes. It was the season of migration, and the Indians from various distant parts were passing and repassing in great numbers. Mr. Mackenzie now detached a small band, under the conduct of Mr. John Reed, to visit the caches made by Mr. Hunt at the Cauldron Linn, and to bring the contents to his post. As he depended in some measure on them for his supplies of goods and ammunition, they had not been gone a week when 2 Indians arrived of the Pala-Tapala tribe, who live upon a river of the same name. These communicated the unwelcome intelligence that the caches had been robbed. They said that some of their tribe had, in the course of the preceding spring, been across the mountains which separated them from Snake River, and had traded horses with the Snakes in exchange for blankets, robes, and goods of various descriptions. These articles the Snakes had procured from caches to which they were guided by some white men who resided among them, and who afterwards accompanied them across the Rocky Mountains. This intelligence was extremely perplexing to Mr. Mackenzie, but the truth of part of it was confirmed by the 2 Indians, who brought them an English saddle and bridle, which was recognized as having belonged to Mr. Crooks. The perfidy of the white men who revealed the secret of the caches was, however, perfectly inexplicable. We shall presently account for it in narrating the expedition of Mr. Reed. That worthy Hibernian proceeded on his mission with his usual alacrity. His forlorn travels of the preceding winter had made him acquainted with the topography of the country, and he reached Snake River without any material difficulty. Here, in an encampment of the natives, he met with 6 white men, wanderers from the main expedition of Mr. Hunt, who, after having had their respective shares of adventures and mishaps, had fortunately come together at this place. 3 of these men were Turcotte, La Chapelle, and Francis Landry. The 3 Canadian voyageurs, who it may be recollected had left Mr. Crooks in February in the neighborhood of Snake River, being dismayed by the increasing hardships of the journey and fearful of perishing of hunger. They had returned to a snake encampment where they passed the residue of the winter. Early in the spring, being utterly destitute and in great extremity, and having worn out the hospitality of the snakes, they determined to avail themselves of the buried treasures within their knowledge. They accordingly informed the snake chieftains that they knew where a great quantity of goods had been left in caches, enough to enrich the whole tribe, and offered to conduct them to the place, on condition of being rewarded with horses and provisions. The chieftains pledged their faith and honor as great men and snakes, and the 3 Canadians conducted them to the place of deposit at the Cauldron Linn. This is the way that the savages got knowledge of the caches, and not by following the tracks of wolves, as Mr. Stuart had supposed. Never did money-diggers turn up a miser's hoard with more eager delight than did the savages lay open the treasures of the caches. Blankets and robes, brass trinkets and blue beads were drawn forth with chuckling exultation, and long strips of scarlet cloth produced yells of ecstasy. The rifling of the caches effected a change in the fortunes and deportment of the whole party. The snakes were better clad and equipped than ever were snakes before, and the 3 Canadians, suddenly finding themselves with horse to ride and weapon to wear, were like beggars on horseback, ready to ride on any wild scamper. An opportunity soon presented. The snakes determined on a hunting match on the buffalo prairies to lay in a supply of beef, that they might live in plenty, as became men of their improved condition. The 3 newly mounted cavaliers must fain accompany them. They all traversed the Rocky Mountains in safety, descending to the headwaters of the Missouri, and made great havoc among the buffaloes. Their hunting camp was full of meat. They were gorging themselves, like true Indians, with present plenty, and drying and jerking great quantities for a winter's supply. In the midst of their revelry and good cheer, the camp was surprised by the Blackfeet. Several of the snakes were slain on the spot. The residue, with their 3 Canadian allies, fled to the mountains, stripped of horses, buffalo meat, and everything, and made their way back to the old encampment on Snake River, poorer than ever, but esteeming themselves fortunate in having escaped with their lives. They had not been long there when the Canadians were cheered by the sight of a companion in misfortune, Drubriel, the poor voyageur who had left Mr. Crooks in March, being too much exhausted to keep on with him. Not long afterwards 3 other straggling members of the main expedition made their appearance. These were Carson, St. Michael, and Pierre Delaunay, 3 of the trappers who, in company with Pierre de Taille, had been left among the mountains by Mr. Hunt to trap beaver in the preceding month of September. They had departed from the main body well armed and provided with horses to ride and horses to carry the peltries they were to collect. They came wandering into the snake camp as ragged and destitute as their predecessors. It appears that they had finished their trapping and were making their way in the spring to the Missouri, when they were met and attacked by a powerful band of the all-pervading Crows. They made a desperate resistance and killed 7 of the savages, but were overpowered by numbers. Pierre de Taille was slain. The rest were robbed of horses and effects and obliged to turn back, when they fell in with their old companions, as already mentioned. We should observe that at the heels of Pierre de Launay came draggling an Indian wife, whom he had picked up in his wanderings, having grown weary of celibacy among the savages. The whole 7 of this forlorn fraternity of adventurers, thus accidentally congregated on the banks of Snake River, were making arrangements once more to cross the mountains, when some Indian scouts brought word of the approach of the little band headed by John Reed. The latter, having heard the several stories of these wanderers, took them all into his party and set out for the Cauldron Linn to clear out 2 or 3 of the caches which had not been revealed to the Indians. At that place he met with Robinson, the Kentucky veteran, who with his 2 comrades, Resner and Hoback, had remained there when Mr. Stuart went on. This adventurous trio had been trapping higher up the river, but Robinson had come down in a canoe to await the expected arrival of the party and obtain horses and equipments. He told Reed the story of the robbery of his party by the Arapahes, but it differed in some particulars from the account given by him to Mr. Stuart, in that he had represented Cass as having shamefully deserted his companions in their extremity, carrying off with him a horse. In the one now given, he spoke of him as having been killed in the affray with the Arapahes. This discrepancy, of which, of course, Reed could have had no knowledge at the time, concurred with other circumstances to occasion afterwards some mysterious speculations and dark surmises as to the real fate of Cass. But as no substantial grounds were ever adduced for them, we forbear to throw any deeper shades into this story of sufferings in the wilderness. Mr. Reed, having gathered the remainder of the goods from the caches, put himself at the head of his party, now augmented by the 7 men thus casually picked up, and the squaw of Pierre de Launay, and made his way successfully to Mackenzie's post on the waters of the Shahaptan. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains, by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Departure of Mr. Hunt in the Beaver, precautions at the factory, detachment to the Willamette, gloomy apprehensions, arrival of Mackenzie, affairs at the Shahaptan, news of war, dismay of McDougall, determination to abandon Astoria, departure of Mackenzie for the interior, adventure at the rapids, visit to the ruffians of Wishram, a perilous situation, meeting with McTavish and his party, arrival at the Shahaptan, plundered caches, determination of the wintering partners not to leave the country, arrival of Clark among the Nez Perces, the affair of the silver goblet, hanging of an Indian, arrival of the wintering partners at Astoria, determination of the wintering partners not to leave the country. After the departure of the different detachments or brigades, as they are called by the fur traders, the Beaver prepared for her voyage along the coast and her visit to the Russian establishment at New Archangel, where she was to carry supplies. It had been determined in the Council of Partners at Astoria that Mr. Hunt should embark in this vessel for the purpose of acquainting himself with the coasting trade and of making arrangements with the commander of the Russian post, and that he should be re-landed in October at Astoria by the Beaver on her way to the Sandwich Islands and Canton. The Beaver put to sea in the month of August. Her departure, and that of the various brigades, left the fortress of Astoria but slightly garrisoned. This was soon perceived by some of the Indian tribes, and the consequence was increased insolence of deportment and a disposition to hostility. It was now the fishing season, when the tribes from the northern coast drew into the neighborhood of the Columbia. These were warlike and perfidious in their dispositions, and noted for their attempts to surprise trading ships. Among them were numbers of the noteworthies, the ferocious tribe that massacred the crew of the Tonquin. Great precautions, therefore, were taken at the factory to guard against surprise while these dangerous intruders were in the vicinity. Galleries were constructed inside of the palisades. The bastions were heightened, and sentinels were posted day and night. Fortunately, the Chinooks and other tribes resident in the vicinity manifested the most pacific disposition. Old Concomly, who held sway over them, was a shrewd calculator. He was aware of the advantages of having the whites as neighbors and allies, and of the consequence derived to himself and his people from acting as intermediate traders between them and the distant tribes. He had, therefore, by this time become a firm friend of the Astorians, and formed a kind of barrier between them and the hostile intruders from the north. The summer of 1812 passed away without any of the hostilities that had been apprehended. The noteworthies and other dangerous visitors to the neighborhood finished their fishing and returned home, and the inmates of the factory once more felt secure from attack. It now became necessary to guard against other evils. The season of scarcity arrived, which commences in October and lasts until the end of January. To provide for the support of the garrison, the shallop was employed to forage about the shores of the river. A number of the men also, under the command of some of the clerks, were sent to quarter themselves on the bank of the Willamette, the Multnomah of Lewis and Clark, a fine river which disembogues itself into the Columbia about 60 miles above Astoria. The country bordering on the river is finely diversified with prairies and hills, and forests of oak, ash, maple, and cedar. It abounded at that time with elk and deer, and the streams were well stocked with beaver. Here the party, after supplying their own wants, were enabled to pack up quantities of dried meat and send it by canoes to Astoria. The month of October elapsed without the return of the beaver. November, December, January passed away, and still nothing was seen or heard of her. Gloomy apprehensions now began to be entertained. She might have been wrecked in the course of her coasting voyage, or surprised, like the Tonquin, by some of the treacherous tribes of the north. No one indulged more in these apprehensions than McDougall, who had now the charge of the establishment. He no longer evinced the bustling confidence and buoyancy which once characterized him. Command seemed to have lost its charms for him, or rather he gave way to the most abject despondency, decrying the whole enterprise, magnifying every untoward circumstance, and foreboding nothing but evil. While in this moody state, he was surprised on the 16th of January by the sudden appearance of Mackenzie, way-worn and weather-beaten by a long, wintry journey from his post on the Shahapton, and with a face the very frontispiece for a volume of misfortune. Mackenzie had been heartily disgusted and disappointed at his post. It was in the midst of the Tushapas, a powerful and warlike nation, divided into many tribes under different chiefs, who possessed innumerable horses, but, not having turned their attention to beaver trapping, had no furs to offer. According to Mackenzie, they were but a rascally tribe, from which we may infer that they were prone to consult their own interests more than comported with the interests of a greedy Indian trader. Game being scarce, he was obliged to rely for the most part on horse flesh for subsistence, and the Indians, discovering his necessities, adopted a policy usual in civilized trade, and raised the price of horses to an exorbitant rate, knowing that he and his men must eat or die. In this way, the goods he had brought to trade for beaver skins were likely to be bartered for horse flesh, and all the proceeds devoured upon the spot. He had dispatched trappers in various directions, But the country round did not offer more beaver than his own station. In this emergency he began to think of abandoning his unprofitable post, sending his goods to the posts of Clark and David Stuart, who could make a better use of them, as they were in a good beaver country, and returning with his party to Astoria to seek some better destination. With this view he repaired to the post of Mr. Clark to hold a consultation. While the two partners were in conference in Mr. Clark's wigwam, an unexpected visitor came bustling in upon them. This was Mr. John George McTavish, a partner of the Northwest Company, who had charge of the rival trading posts established in that neighborhood. Mr. McTavish was the delighted messenger of bad news. He had been to Lake Winnipeg, where he received an express from Canada containing the declaration of war, and President Madison's proclamation, which he handed with the most officious complaisance to Messrs. Clark and Mackenzie. He moreover told them that he had received a fresh supply of goods from the Northwest posts on the other side of the Rocky Mountains, and was prepared for vigorous opposition to the establishment of the American Company. He capped the climax of this obliging but belligerent intelligence by informing them that the armed ship Isaac Todd was to be at the mouth of the Columbia about the beginning of March to get possession of the trade of the river, and that he was ordered to join her there at that time. The receipt of this news determined Mackenzie. He immediately returned to the Shahaptan, broke up his establishment, deposited his goods in cash, and hastened with all his people to Astoria. The intelligence thus brought completed the dismay of McDougall, and seemed to produce a complete confusion of mind. He held a council of war with Mackenzie, at which some of the clerks were present, but of course had no votes. They gave up all hope of maintaining their post at Astoria. The beaver had probably been lost. They could receive no aid from the United States, as all the ports would be blockaded. From England nothing could be expected but hostility. It was determined, therefore, to abandon the establishment in the course of the following spring and return across the Rocky Mountains. In pursuance of this resolution, they suspended all trade with the natives, except for provisions, having already more peltries than they could carry away, and having need of all the goods for the clothing and subsistence of their people during the remainder of their sojourn and on their journey across the mountains. This intention of abandoning Astoria was, however, kept secret from the men, lest they should at once give up all labor and become restless and insubordinate. In the meantime, Mackenzie set off for his post at the Shahaptan to get his goods from the caches, and buy horses and provisions with them for the caravan across the mountains. He was charged with dispatches from McDougall to Messrs. Stuart and Clark, appraising them of the intended migration, that they might make timely preparations. Mackenzie was accompanied by two of the clerks, Mr. John Reed, the Irishman, and Mr. Alfred Seaton of New York. They embarked in 2 canoes manned by 17 men, and ascended the river without any incident of importance until they arrived in the eventful neighborhood of the Rapids. They made the portage of the Narrows and the Falls early in the afternoon, and having partaken of a scanty meal, had now a long evening on their hands. On the opposite side of the river lay the village of Wishram, of freebooting renown. Here lived the savages who had robbed and maltreated Reed when bearing his tin box of dispatches. It was known that the rifle of which he was despoiled was retained as a trophy at the village. Mackenzie offered to cross the river and demand the rifle, if anyone would accompany him. It was a harebrained project, for these villages were noted for the ruffian character of their inhabitants. Yet 2 volunteers promptly stepped forward, Alfred Seaton the clerk, and Joe de la Pierre the cook. The trio soon reached the opposite side of the river. On landing, they freshly primed their rifles and pistols. A path winding for about 100 yards among rocks and crags led to the village. No notice seemed to be taken of their approach. Not a solitary being, man, woman, or child greeted them. The very dogs, those noisy pests of an Indian town, kept silence. On entering the village, a boy made his appearance and pointed to a house of larger dimensions than the rest. They had to stoop to enter it. As soon as they had passed the threshold, the narrow passage behind them was filled up by a sudden rush of Indians who had before kept out of sight. Mackenzie and his companions found themselves in a rude chamber of about 25 feet long and 20 wide. A bright fire was blazing at one end, near which sat the chief, about 60 years old. A large number of Indians, wrapped in buffalo robes, were squatted in rows, 3 deep, forming a semicircle around 3 sides of the room. A single glance around sufficed to show them the grim and dangerous assembly into which they had intruded, and that all retreat was cut off by the mass which blocked up the entrance. The chief pointed to the vacant side of the room opposite to the door, and motioned for them to take their seats. They complied. A dead pause ensued. The grim warriors around sat like statues, each muffled in his robe, with his fierce eyes bent on the intruders. The latter felt they were in a perilous predicament. "Keep your eyes on the chief while I am addressing him," said Mackenzie to his companions. "Should he give any sign to his band, shoot him and make for the door." Mackenzie advanced and offered the pipe of peace to the chief, but it was refused. He then made a regular speech, explaining the object of their visit and proposing to give in exchange for the rifle 2 blankets, an axe, some beads, and tobacco. When he had done, the chief rose, began to address him in a low voice, but soon became loud and violent. He ended by working himself up into a furious passion. He upbraided the white men for their sordid conduct in passing and repassing through their neighborhood without giving them a blanket or any other article of goods, merely because they had no furs to barter in exchange, and he alluded, with menaces of vengeance, to the death of the Indian killed by the whites in the skirmish at the falls. Matters were verging to a crisis. It was evident the surrounding savages were only waiting a signal from the chief to spring upon their prey. Mackenzie and his companions had gradually risen on their feet during the speech and had brought their rifles to a horizontal position, the barrels resting in their left hands. The muzzle of Mackenzie's piece was within 3 feet of the speaker's heart. They cocked their rifles. The click of the locks for a moment suffused the dark cheek of the savage, and there was a pause. They coolly but promptly advanced to the door. The Indians fell back in awe and suffered them to pass. The sun was just setting as they emerged from this dangerous den. They took the precaution to keep along the tops of the rocks as much as possible on their way back to the canoe, and reached their camp in safety, congratulating themselves on their escape, and feeling no desire to make a second visit to the grim warriors of Wishram. Mackenzie and his party resumed their journey the next morning. At some distance above the falls of the Columbia, they observed 2 bark canoes filled with white men coming down the river, to the full chant of a set of Canadian voyageurs. A parley ensued. It was a detachment of Northwesters, under the command of Mr. George McTavish, bound full of song and spirit to the mouth of the Columbia to await the arrival of the Isaac Todd. Mackenzie and McTavish came to a halt, and landing, encamped for the night. The voyageurs of either party hailed each other as brothers and old comrades, and they mingled together as if united by one common interest, instead of belonging to rival companies and trading under hostile flags. In the morning they proceeded on their different ways, in style corresponding to their different fortunes, the one toiling painfully against the stream, the other sweeping down gaily with the current. Mackenzie arrived safely at his deserted post on the Shahapton, but found, to his chagrin, that his caches had been discovered and rifled by the Indians. Here was a dilemma, for on the stolen goods he had depended to purchase horses of the Indians. He sent out men in all directions to endeavor to discover the thieves, and dispatched Mr. Reed to the posts of Messrs. Clark and David Stuart with the letters of Mr. McDougall. The resolution announced in these letters to break up and depart from Astoria was condemned by both Clark and Stuart. These two gentlemen had been very successful at their posts, and considered it rash and pusillanimous to abandon on the first difficulty an enterprise of such great cost and ample promise. They made no arrangements, therefore, for leaving the country, but acted with a view to the maintenance of their new and prosperous establishments. The regular time approached when the partners of the interior posts were to rendezvous at the mouth of the Walla Walla, on their way to Astoria, with the peltries they had collected. Mr. Clark accordingly packed all his furs on 28 horses, and leaving a clerk and 4 men to take charge of the post, departed on the 25th of May with the residue of his force. On the 30th he arrived at the confluence of the Pavilion and Lewis rivers, where he had left his barge and canoes in the guardianship of the old pierced-nosed chieftain. That dignitary had acquitted himself more faithfully to his charge than Mr. Clark had expected, and the canoes were found in a very tolerable order. Some repairs were necessary, and while they were making, the party encamped close by the village. Having had repeated and vexatious proofs of the pilfering propensities of this tribe during his former visit, Mr. Clark ordered that a wary eye should be kept upon them. He was a tall, good-looking man, and somewhat given to pomp and circumstance, which made him an object of note in the eyes of the wondering savages. He was stately, too, in his appointments, and had a silver goblet or drinking cup, out of which he would drink with a magnificent air, and then lock it up in a large garde-vin, which accompanied him in his travels and stood in his tent. This goblet had originally been sent as a present from Mr. Astor to Mr. Mackay, the partner who had unfortunately been blown up in the Tonquin. As it reached Astoria after the departure of that gentleman, it had remained in the possession of Mr. Clark. A silver goblet was too glittering a prize not to catch the eye of a pierced nose. It was like the shining tin case of John Reed. Such a wonder had never been seen in the land before. The Indians talked about it to one another. They marked the care with which it was deposited in the garde-vin, like a relic in its shrine, and concluded that it must be a great medicine. That night Mr. Clark neglected to lock up his treasure. In the morning the sacred casket was open, the precious relic gone. Clark was now outrageous. All the past vexations that he had suffered from this pilfering community rose to mind, and he threatened that unless the goblet was promptly returned, he would hang the thief, should he eventually discover him. The day passed away, however, without the restoration of the cup. At night, sentinels were secretly posted about the camp. With all their vigilance, a pierced nose contrived to get into the camp unperceived, and to load himself with booty. It was only on his retreat that he was discovered and taken. At daybreak the culprit was brought to trial and promptly convicted. He stood responsible for all the spoliations of the camp, the precious goblet among the number, and Mr. Clark passed sentence of death upon him. A gibbet was accordingly constructed of oars. The chief of the village and his people were assembled, and the culprit was produced, with his legs and arms pinioned. Clark then made a harangue. He reminded the tribe of the benefits he had bestowed upon them during his former visits, and the many thefts and other misdeeds which he had overlooked. The prisoner especially had always been peculiarly well treated by the white men, but had repeatedly been guilty of pilfering. He was to be punished for his own misdeeds and as a warning to his tribe. The Indians now gathered around Mr. Clark and interceded for the culprit. They were willing he should be punished severely, but implored that his life might be spared. The companions, too, of Mr. Clark considered the sentence too severe and advised him to mitigate it, but he was inexorable. He was not naturally a stern or cruel man, but from his boyhood he had lived in the Indian country among Indian traders, and held the life of a savage extremely cheap. He was, moreover, a firm believer in the doctrine of intimidation. Farnham, a clerk, a tall Green Mountain boy from Vermont, who had been robbed of a pistol, acted as executioner. The signal was given, and the poor pierced nose, resisting, struggling, and screaming in the most frightful manner, was launched into eternity. The Indians stood round gazing in silence and mute awe, but made no attempt to oppose the execution, nor testified any emotion when it was over. They locked up their feelings within their bosoms until an opportunity should arrive to gratify them with a bloody act of vengeance. To say nothing of the needless severity of this act, its impolicy was glaringly obvious. Mr. McLennan and 3 men were to return to the post with the horses, their loads having been transferred to the canoes. They would have to pass through a tract of country infested by this tribe, who were all horsemen and hard riders, and might pursue them to take vengeance for the death of their comrade. McLennan, however, was a resolute fellow, and made light of all dangers. He and his 3 men were present at the execution, and set off as soon as life was extinct in the victim. But, to use the words of one of their comrades, they did not let the grass grow under the heels of their horses, as they clattered out of the pierced nose country, and were glad to find themselves in safety at the post. Mr. Clark and his party embarked about the same time in their canoes, and early on the following day reached the mouth of the Walla Walla, where they found Messrs. Stuart and Mackenzie awaiting them, the latter having recovered part of the goods stolen from his cache. Clark informed them of the signal punishment he had inflicted on the pierced nose, evidently expecting to excite their admiration by such a hardy act of justice, performed in the very midst of the Indian country, but was mortified at finding it strongly censured as inhuman, unnecessary, and likely to provoke hostilities. The parties thus united formed a squadron of 2 boats and 6 canoes, with which they performed their voyage in safety down the river, and arrived at Astoria on the 12th of June, bringing with them a valuable stock of peltries. About 10 days previously, the brigade which had been quartered on the banks of the Willamette had arrived with numerous packs of beaver, the result of a few months' sojourn on that river. These were the first fruits of the enterprise, gathered by men as yet mere strangers in the land, but they were such as to give substantial grounds for sanguine anticipations of profit, when the country should be more completely explored and the trade established. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains, by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The partners displeased with McDougall. Equivocal conduct of that gentleman. Partners agree to abandon Astoria. Sale of goods to McTavish. Arrangements for the year. Manifesto signed by the partners. Departure of McTavish for the interior. The partners found Mr. McDougall in all the bustle of preparation, having about 9 days previously announced at the factory his intention of breaking up the establishment, and fixed upon the 1st of July for the time of departure. Messrs. Stuart and Clark felt highly displeased at his taking so precipitate a step, without waiting for their concurrence, when he must have known that their arrival could not be far distant. Indeed, the whole conduct of Mr. McDougall was such as to awaken strong doubts as to his loyal devotion to the cause. His old sympathies with the Northwest Company seemed to have revived. He had received McTavish and his party with uncalled-for hospitality, as though they were friends and allies, instead of being a party of observation come to reconnoiter the state of affairs at Astoria, and to await the arrival of a hostile ship. Had they been left to themselves, they would have been starved off for want of provisions, or driven away by the Chinooks, who only wanted a signal from the factory to treat them as intruders and enemies. McDougall, on the contrary, had supplied them from the stores of the garrison, and had gained them the favor of the Indians by treating them as friends. Having set his mind fixedly on the project of breaking up the establishment at Astoria in the current year, McDougall was sorely disappointed at finding that Messrs. Stuart and Clark had omitted to comply with his request to purchase horses and provisions for the caravan across the mountains. It was now too late to make the necessary preparations in time for traversing the mountains before winter, and the project had to be postponed. In the meantime, the non-arrival of the annual ship and the apprehensions entertained by the loss of the Beaver and of Mr. Hunt had their effect upon the minds of Messrs. Stuart and Clark. They began to listen to the desponding representations of McDougall, seconded by Mackenzie, who inveighed against their situation as desperate and forlorn, left to shift for themselves or perish upon a barbarous coast, neglected by those who sent them there, and threatened with dangers of every kind. In this way they were brought to consent to the plan of abandoning the country in the ensuing year. About this time McTavish applied at the factory to purchase a small supply of goods wherewith to trade his way back to his post on the upper waters of the Columbia, having waited in vain for the arrival of the Isaac Todd. His request brought on a consultation among the partners. McDougall urged that it should be complied with. He furthermore proposed that they should give up to McTavish, for a proper consideration, the post on the Spokane and all its dependencies, as they had not sufficient goods on hand to supply that post themselves, and to keep up a competition with the Northwest Company in the trade with the neighboring Indians. This last representation has since been proved incorrect. By inventories, it appears that their stock in hand for the supply of the interior posts was superior to that of the Northwest Company, so that they had nothing to fear from competition. Through the influence of Messrs. McDougall and Mackenzie, this proposition was adopted and was promptly accepted by McTavish. The merchandise sold to him amounted to $858, to be paid for in the following spring in horses or in any other manner most acceptable to the partners at that period. This agreement being concluded, the partners formed their plans for the year that they would yet have to pass in the country. Their objects were chiefly present subsistence and the purchase of horses for the contemplated journey, though they were likewise to collect as much peltries as their diminished means would command. Accordingly, it was arranged that David Stuart should return to his former post on the Okanagan, and Mr. Clark should make his sojourn among the Flatheads. John Reed, the sturdy Hibernian, was to undertake the Snake River country, accompanied by Pierre Dorion and Pierre Delaunay as hunters, and Francis Landry, Jean-Baptiste Turcotte, André La Chapelle, and Gilles Leclerc, Canadian voyageurs. Astoria, however, was the post about which they felt the greatest solicitude, and on which they all more or less depended. The maintenance of this in safety throughout the coming year was therefore their grand consideration. Mr. McDougall was to continue in command of it with a party of 40 men. They would have to depend chiefly upon the neighboring savages for their subsistence. These at present were friendly, but it was to be feared that when they should discover the exigencies of the post and its real weakness, they might proceed to hostilities, or at any rate might cease to furnish their usual supplies. It was important, therefore, to render the place as independent as possible of the surrounding tribes for its support, and it was accordingly resolved that Mackenzie, with 4 hunters and 8 common men, should winter in the abundant country of Willamette, from which they might be enabled to furnish a constant supply of provisions to Astoria. As there was too great a proportion of clerks for the number of privates in the service, the engagements of 3 of them, Cox, Ross, and McClellan, were surrendered to them, and they immediately enrolled themselves in the service of the Northwest Company, glad, no doubt, to escape from what they considered a sinking ship. Having made all these arrangements, the 4 partners, on the 1st of July, signed a formal manifesto stating the alarming state of their affairs from the non-arrival of the annual ship and the absence and apprehended loss of the beaver, their want of goods, their despair of receiving any further supply, their ignorance of the coast, and their disappointment as to the interior trade, which they pronounced unequal to the expenses incurred and incompetent to stand against the powerful opposition of the Northwest Company. And as by the 16th article of the company's agreement, they were authorized to abandon this undertaking and dissolve the concern, if before the period of 5 years it should be found unprofitable, they now formally announced their intention to do so on the 1st day of June of the ensuing year, unless in the interim they should receive the necessary support and supplies from Mr. Astor or the stockholders, with orders to continue. This instrument, accompanied by private letters of similar import, was delivered to Mr. McTavish, who departed on the 5th of July. He engaged to forward the dispatches to Mr. Astor by the usual winter express sent overland by the Northwest Company. The manifesto was signed with great reluctance by Messrs. Clark and D. Stuart, whose experience by no means justified the discouraging account given in it of the internal trade, and who considered the main difficulties of exploring an unknown and savage country, and of ascertaining the best trading and trapping grounds, in a great measure overcome. They were overruled, however, by the urgent instances of McDougall and Mackenzie, who, having resolved upon abandoning the enterprise, were desirous of making as strong a case as possible to excuse their conduct to Mr. Astor and to the world. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anxieties of Mr. Astor. Memorial of the Northwest Company. Tidings of a British naval expedition against Astoria. Mr. Astor applies to government for protection. The frigate Adams ordered to be fitted out. Bright news from Astoria. Sunshine suddenly overclouded. While difficulties and disasters had been gathering about the infant settlement of Astoria, the mind of its projector at New York was a prey to great anxiety. The ship Lark, dispatched by him with supplies for the establishment, sailed on the 6th of March, 1813. Within a fortnight afterwards, he received intelligence which justified all his apprehensions of hostility on the part of the British. The Northwest Company had made a second memorial to that government, representing Astoria as an American establishment, stating the vast scope of its contemplated operations, magnifying the strength of its fortifications, and expressing their fears that, unless crushed in the bud, it would effect the downfall of their trade. Influenced by these representations, the British government ordered the frigate Phoebe to be detached as a convoy for the armed ship Isaac Todd, which was ready to sail with men and munitions for forming a new establishment. They were to proceed together to the mouth of the Columbia, capture or destroy whatever American fortress they should find there, and plant the British flag on its ruins. Informed of these movements, Mr. Astor lost no time in addressing a second letter to the Secretary of State, communicating this intelligence and requesting it might be laid before the President. As no notice, however, had been taken of his previous letter, he contented himself with this simple communication and made no further application for aid. Awakened now to the danger that menaced the establishment at Astoria, and aware of the importance of protecting this foothold of American commerce and empire on the shores of the Pacific, the government determined to send the frigate Adams, Captain Crane, upon this service. On hearing of this determination, Mr. Astor immediately proceeded to fit out a ship called the Enterprise to sail in company with the Adams, freighted with additional supplies and reinforcements for Astoria. About the middle of June, while in the midst of these preparations, Mr. Astor received a letter from Mr. R. Stuart, dated St. Louis, May 1st, confirming the intelligence already received through the public newspapers of his safe return and of the arrival of Mr. Hunt and his party at Astoria, and giving the most flattering accounts of the prosperity of the enterprise. So deep had been the anxiety of Mr. Astor for the success of this object of his ambition, that this gleam of good news was almost overpowering. "I felt ready," said he, "to fall upon my knees in a transport of gratitude." At the same time he heard that the Beaver had made good her voyage from New York to the Columbia. This was additional ground of hope for the welfare of the little colony. The post being thus relieved and strengthened, with an American at its head and a ship of war about to sail for its protection, the prospect for the future seemed full of encouragement, and Mr. Astor proceeded with fresh vigor to fit out his merchant ship. Unfortunately for Astoria, this bright gleam of sunshine was soon overclouded. Just as the Adams had received her complement of men, and the two vessels were ready for sea, news came from Commodore Chauncey, commanding on Lake Ontario, that a reinforcement of seamen was wanted in that quarter. The demand was urgent. The crew of the Adams was immediately transferred to that service, and the ship was laid up. This was a most ill-timed and discouraging blow, but Mr. Astor would not yet allow himself to pause in his undertaking. He determined to send the Enterprise to sea alone, and let her take the chance of making her unprotected way across the ocean. Just at this time, however, a British force made its appearance off the Hook, and the port of New York was effectually blockaded. To send a ship to sea under these circumstances would be to expose her to almost certain capture. The Enterprise was therefore unloaded and dismantled, and Mr. Astor was obliged to comfort himself with the hope that the Lark might reach Astoria in safety, and that, aided by her supplies and by the good management of Mr. Hunt and his associates, the little colony might be able to maintain itself until the return of peace. End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Affairs of State at Astoria. MacDougall proposes for the hand of an Indian princess. Matrimonial embassy to Concomly. Matrimonial notions among the Chinooks. Settlements and pin money. The bringing home of the bride. A managing father-in-law. Arrival of Mr. Hunt at Astoria. We have hitherto had so much to relate of a gloomy and disastrous nature that it is with a feeling of momentary relief we turn to something of a more pleasing complexion, and record the first, and indeed only, nuptials in high life that took place in the infant settlement of Astoria. MacDougall, who appears to have been a man of 1,000 projects, and of great though somewhat irregular ambition, suddenly conceived the idea of seeking the hand of one of the native princesses, a daughter of the one-eyed potentate Comcomly, who held sway over the fishing tribe of the Chinooks, and had long supplied the factory with smelts and sturgeons. Some accounts give rather a romantic origin to this affair, tracing it to the stormy night when MacDougall, in the course of an exploring expedition, was driven by stress of weather to seek shelter in the royal abode of Comcomly. Then and there he was first struck with the charms of the piscatory princess, as she exerted herself to entertain her father's guest. The Journal of Astoria, however, which was kept under his own eye, records this union as a high state alliance and great stroke of policy. The factory had to depend in a great measure on the Chinooks for provisions. They were at present friendly, but it was to be feared they would prove otherwise should they discover the weakness and the exigencies of the post, and the intention to leave the country. This alliance, therefore, would infallibly rivet Comcomly to the interests of the Astorians, and with him the powerful tribe of the Chinooks. Be this as it may, and it is hard to fathom the real policy of governors and princes, MacDougall dispatched 2 of the clerks as ambassadors extraordinary to wait upon the one-eyed chieftain and make overtures for the hand of his daughter. The Chinooks, though not a very refined nation, have notions of matrimonial arrangements that would not disgrace the most refined sticklers for settlements and pin money. The suitor repairs not to the bower of his mistress, but to her father's lodge, and throws down a present at his feet. His wishes are then disclosed by some discreet friend employed by him for the purpose. If the suitor and his present find favor in the eyes of the father, he breaks the matter to his daughter and inquires into the state of her inclinations. Should her answer be favorable, the suit is accepted, and the lover has to make further presents to the father of horses, canoes, and other valuables, according to the beauty and merits of the bride, looking forward to a return in kind whenever they shall go to housekeeping. We have more than once had occasion to speak of the shrewdness of Comcomly, but never was it exerted more adroitly than on this occasion. He was a great friend of MacDougall, and pleased with the idea of having so distinguished a son-in-law, but so favorable an opportunity of benefiting his own fortune was not likely to occur a second time, and he determined to make the most of it. Accordingly, the negotiation was protracted with true diplomatic skill. Conference after conference was held with the 2 ambassadors. Comcomly was extravagant in his terms, rating the charms of his daughter at the highest price, and indeed she is represented as having one of the flattest and most aristocratical heads in the tribe. At length the preliminaries were all happily adjusted. On the 20th of July, early in the afternoon, a squadron of canoes crossed over from the village of the Chinooks, bearing the royal family of Comcomly and all his court. That worthy sachem landed in princely state, arrayed in a bright blue blanket and red breechclout, with an extra quantity of paint and feathers, attended by a train of half-naked warriors and nobles. A horse was in waiting to receive the princess, who was mounted behind one of the clerks, and thus conveyed, coy but compliant, to the fortress. Here she was received with devout though decent joy by her expecting bridegroom. Her bridal adornments, it is true, at first caused some little dismay, having painted and anointed herself for the occasion according to the Chinook toilet. By dint, however, of copious ablutions, she was freed from all adventitious tint and fragrance, and entered into the nuptial state, the cleanest princess that had ever been known, of the somewhat unctuous tribe of the Chinooks. From that time forward, Comcomly was a daily visitor at the fort, and was admitted into the most intimate counsels of his son-in-law. He took an interest in everything that was going forward, but was particularly frequent in his visits to the blacksmith's shop, tasking the labors of the artificer in iron for every state, insomuch that the necessary business of the factory was often postponed to attend to his requisitions. The honeymoon had scarce passed away, and MacDougall was seated with his bride in the fortress of Astoria, when, about noon on the 20th of August, Gassacop, the son of Comcomly, hurried into his presence with great agitation, and announced a ship at the mouth of the river. The news produced a vast sensation. Was it a ship of peace or war? Was it American or British? Was it the Beaver or the Isaac Todd? MacDougall hurried to the waterside, threw himself into a boat, and ordered the hands to pull with all speed for the mouth of the harbor. Those in the fort remained watching the entrance of the river, anxious to know whether they were to prepare for greeting a friend or fighting an enemy. At length the ship was descried crossing the bar and bending her course towards Astoria. Every gaze was fixed upon her in silent scrutiny, until the American flag was recognized. A general shout was the first expression of joy, and next a salutation was thundered from the cannon of the fort. The vessel came to anchor on the opposite side of the river, and returned the salute. The boat of Mr. MacDougall went on board, and was seen returning late in the afternoon. The Astorians watched her with straining eyes to discover who were on board, but the sun went down and the evening closed in before she was sufficiently near. At length she reached the land, and Mr. Hunt stepped on shore. He was hailed as one risen from the dead, and his return was a signal for merriment almost equal to that which prevailed at the nuptials of MacDougall. We must now explain the cause of this gentleman's long absence, which had given rise to such gloomy and dispiriting surmises. End of chapter 56. Chapter 57 of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Voyage of the Beaver to New Archangel. A Russian governor. Roistering rule. The tyranny of the table. Hard drinking bargainings. Voyage to Kamchatka. Seal catching establishment at St. Paul's. Storms at sea. Mr. Hunt left at the Sandwich Islands. Transactions of the Beaver at Canton. Return of Mr. Hunt to Astoria. It will be recollected that the destination of the Boston, when she sailed from Astoria on the 4th of August in 1812, was to proceed northwardly along the coast to Sitka, or New Archangel, there to dispose of that part of her cargo intended for the supply of the Russian establishment at that place, and then to return to Astoria, where it was expected she would arrive in October. New Archangel is situated in Norfolk Sound, latitude 57 degrees, 2 minutes north, longitude 135 degrees, 50 minutes west. It was the headquarters of the different colonies of the Russian Fur Company, and the common rendezvous of the American vessels trading along the coast. The Beaver met with nothing worthy of particular mention in her voyage, and arrived at New Archangel on the 19th of August. The place at that time was the residence of Count Baranoff, the governor of the different colonies, a rough, rugged, hospitable, hard-drinking old Russian, somewhat of a soldier, somewhat of a trader, above all a boon companion of the old roistering school, with a strong cross of the bear. Mr. Hunt found this Hyperborean veteran ensconced in a fort which crested the whole of a rocky promontory. It mounted 100 guns, large and small, and was impregnable to Indian attack, unaided by artillery. Here the old governor lorded it over 60 Russians, who formed the core of the trading establishment, besides an indefinite number of Indian hunters of the Kodiak tribe, who were continually coming and going, or lounging and loitering about the fort, like so many hounds round a sportsman's hunting quarters. Though a loose liver among his guests, the governor was a strict disciplinarian among his men, keeping them in perfect subjection, and having 7 on guard night and day. Besides these immediate serfs and dependents just mentioned, the old Russian potentate exerted a considerable sway over a numerous and irregular class of maritime traders, who looked to him for aid and munitions, and through whom he may be said to have, in some degree, extended his power along the whole northwest coast. These were American captains of vessels engaged in a particular department of the trade. One of these captains would come, in a manner, empty-handed to New Archangel. Here his ship would be furnished with about 50 canoes and 100 Kodiak hunters, and fitted out with provisions and everything necessary for hunting the sea otter on the coast of California, where the Russians have another establishment. The ship would ply along the California coast from place to place, dropping parties of otter hunters in their canoes, furnishing them only with water, and leaving them to depend upon their own dexterity for a maintenance. When a sufficient cargo was collected, she would gather up her canoes and hunters, and return with them to Archangel, where the captain would render in the returns of his voyage, and receive 1/2 of the skins for his share. Over these coasting captains, as we have hinted, the veteran governor exerted some sort of sway, but it was of a peculiar and characteristic kind. It was the tyranny of the table. They were obliged to join him in his prosniks, or carousals, and to drink potations pottle deep. His carousals, too, were not of the most quiet kind, nor were his potations as mild as nectar. "He is continually," said Mr. Hunt, "giving entertainments by way of parade, and if you do not drink raw rum and boiling punch as strong as sulphur, he will insult you as soon as he gets drunk, which is very shortly after sitting down to table." As to any temperance captain who stood fast to his faith and refused to give up his sobriety, he might go elsewhere for a market, for he stood no chance with the governor. Rarely, however, did any cold-water caitiff of the kind darken the doors of old Baranoff. The coasting captains knew too well his humor and their own interests. They joined in his revels. They drank and sang and whooped and hiccuped, until they all got half seas over, and then affairs went on swimmingly. An awful warning to all flinchers occurred shortly before Mr. Hunt's arrival. A young naval officer had recently been sent out by the Emperor to take command of one of the company's vessels. The governor, as usual, had him at his prosniks, and plied him with fiery potations. The young man stood on the defensive until the old count's ire was completely kindled. He carried his point, and made the greenhorn tipsy willy-nilly. In proportion as they grew fuddled, they grew noisy, they quarrelled in their cups. The youngster paid old Baranoff in his own coin by rating him soundly, in reward for which, when sober, he was taken the rounds of 4 pickets and received 79 lashes, doled out with Russian punctuality of punishment. Such was the old grizzled bear with whom Mr. Hunt had to do his business. How he managed to cope with his humor, whether he pledged himself in raw rum and blazing punch, and clinked the can with him as they made their bargains, does not appear upon record. We must infer, however, from his general observations on the absolute sway of this hard-drinking potentate, that he had to conform to the customs of his court, and that their business transactions presented a maudlin mixture of punch and peltry. The greatest annoyance to Mr. Hunt, however, was the delay to which he was subjected in disposing of the cargo of the ship, and getting the requisite returns. With all the governor's devotions to the bottle, he never obfuscated his faculties sufficiently to lose sight of his interest, and is represented by Mr. Hunt as keen, not to say crafty, at a bargain, as the most errant water drinker. A long time was expended negotiating with him, and by the time the bargain was concluded, the month of October had arrived. To add to the delay, he was to be paid for his cargo in seal skins. Now it so happened that there was none of this kind of peltry at the fort of old Baranoff. It was necessary, therefore, for Mr. Hunt to proceed to a seal-catching establishment which the Russian company had at the island of St. Paul in the Sea of Kamchatka. He accordingly set sail on the 4th of October, after having spent 45 days at New Archangel, boozing and bargaining with its roistering commander, and right glad was he to escape from the clutches of this old man of the sea. The Beaver arrived at St. Paul's on the 31st of October, by which time, according to arrangement, he ought to have been back at Astoria. The island of St. Paul is in latitude 57 degrees north, longitude 170 degrees or 171 degrees west. Its shores, in certain places and at certain seasons, are covered with seals, while others are playing about in the water. Of these, the Russians take only the small ones, from 7 to 10 months old, and carefully select the males, giving the females their freedom, that the breed may not be diminished. The islanders, however, kill the large ones for provisions, and for skins wherewith to cover their canoes. They drive them from the shore over the rocks until within a short distance of their habitations, where they kill them. By this means they save themselves the trouble of carrying the skins, and have the flesh at hand. This is thrown in heaps, and when the season for skinning is over, they take out the entrails and make one heap of the blubber. This, with driftwood, serves for fuel, for the island is entirely destitute of trees. They make another heap of the flesh, which, with the eggs of sea fowls, preserved in oil, an occasional sea lion, a few ducks in winter, and some wild roots, composes their food. Mr. Hunt found several Russians at the island, and 100 hunters, natives of Onalaska, with their families. They lived in cabins that looked like canoes, being for the most part formed of the jawbone of a whale, put up as rafters, across which were laid pieces of driftwood covered over with long grass, the skins of large sea animals, and earth, so as to be quite comfortable, in spite of the rigors of the climate, though we are told they had as ancient and fish-like an odor as had the quarters of Jonah when he lodged within the whale. In one of these odoriferous mansions, Mr. Hunt occasionally took up his abode, that he might be at hand to hasten the loading of the ship. The operation, however, was somewhat slow, for it was necessary to overhaul and inspect every pack to prevent imposition, and the peltries had then to be conveyed in large boats made of skins to the ship, which was some little distance from the shore, standing off and on. One night, while Mr. Hunt was on shore, with some others of the crew, there arose a terrible gale. When the day broke, the ship was not to be seen. He watched for her with anxious eyes until night, but in vain. Day after day of boisterous storms and howling wintry weather were passed in watchfulness and solicitude. Nothing was to be seen but a dark and angry sea and a scowling northern sky. And at night he retired within the jaws of the whale and nestled disconsolately among sealskins. At length, on the 13th of November, the Beaver made her appearance, much the worse for the stormy conflicts which she had sustained in those Hyperborean seas. She had been obliged to carry a press of sail in heavy gales to be able to hold her ground, and had consequently sustained great damage in her canvas and rigging. Mr. Hunt lost no time in hurrying the residue of the cargo on board of her. Then bidding adieu to his seal-fishing friends and his whalebone habitation, he put forth once more to sea. He was now for making the best of his way to Astoria, and fortunate would it have been for the interests of that place and the interests of Mr. Astor had he done so. But, unluckily, a perplexing question rose in his mind. The sails and rigging of the Beaver had been much rent and shattered in the late storm. Would she be able to stand the hard gales to be expected in making Columbia River at this season? Was it prudent, also, at this boisterous time of the year, to risk the valuable cargo which she now had on board by crossing and recrossing the dangerous bar of that river? These doubts were probably suggested or enforced by Captain Soul, who, it has already been seen, was an overcautious, or rather a timid seaman, and they may have had some weight with Mr. Hunt. But there were other considerations which more strongly swayed his mind. The lateness of the season and the unforeseen delays the ship had encountered at New Archangel, and by being obliged to proceed to St. Paul's, had put her so much back in her calculated time that there was a risk of her arriving so late at Canton as to come to a bad market, both for the sale of her peltries and the purchase of a return cargo. He considered it to the interests of the company, therefore, that he should proceed at once to the Sandwich Islands, there wait the arrival of the annual vessel from New York, take passage in her to Astoria, and suffer the Beaver to continue on to Canton. On the other hand, he was urged to the other course by his engagements, by the plan of the voyage marked out for the Beaver by Mr. Astor, by his inclination, and the possibility that the establishment might need his presence, and by the recollection that there must already be a large amount of peltries collected at Astoria and waiting for the return of the Beaver to convey them to market. These conflicting questions perplexed and agitated his mind, and gave rise to much anxious reflection, for he was a conscientious man that seems ever to have aimed at a faithful discharge of his duties, and who have had the interests of his employers earnestly at heart. His decision in the present instance was injudicious, and proved unfortunate. It was to bear away for the Sandwich Islands. He persuaded himself that it was a matter of necessity, and that the distressed condition of the ship left him no other alternative. But we rather suspect he was so persuaded by the representations of the timid captain. They accordingly stood for the Sandwich Islands, arrived at Oahu, where the ship underwent the necessary repairs, and again put to sea on the 1st of January, 1813, leaving Mr. Hunt on the island. We will follow the Beaver to Canton, as her fortunes, in some measure, exemplify the evil of commanders of ships acting contrary to orders, and as they form a part of the tissue of cross-purposes that marred the great commercial enterprise we have undertaken to record. The Beaver arrived safe at Canton, where Captain Soul found the letter of Mr. Astor, giving him information of the war and directing him to convey the intelligence to Astoria. He wrote a reply, dictated either by timidity or obstinacy, in which he declined complying with the orders of Mr. Astor, but said he would wait for the return of peace, and then come home. The other proceedings of Captain Soul were equally wrong-headed and unlucky. He was offered $150,000 for the fur he had taken on board at St. Paul's. The goods for which it had been procured cost but $25,000 in New York. Had he accepted this offer and reinvested the amount in nankeens, which at that time, in consequence of the interruption to commerce by the war, were at 2/3 of their usual price, the whole would have brought $300,000 in New York. It is true, the war would have rendered it unsafe to attempt the homeward voyage, but he might have put the goods in store at Canton until after the peace, and have sailed without risk of capture to Astoria, bringing to the partners at that place tidings of the great profits realized on the outward cargo, and the still greater to be expected from the returns. The news of such a brilliant commencement to their undertaking would have counterbalanced the gloomy tidings of the war. It would have infused new spirit into them all, and given them courage and constancy to persevere in the enterprise. Captain Soule, however, refused the offer of $150,000, and stood wavering and chaffering for higher terms. The furs began to fall in value. This only increased his irresolution. They sunk so much that he feared to sell at all. He borrowed money on Mr. Astor's account at an interest of 18%, and laid up his ship to await the return of peace. In the meanwhile, Mr. Hunt soon saw reason to repent the resolution he had adopted in altering the destination of the ship. His stay at the Sandwich Islands was prolonged far beyond expectation. He looked in vain for the annual ship in the spring. Month after month passed by, and still she did not make her appearance. He, too, proved the danger of departing from orders. Had he returned from St. Paul's to Astoria, all the anxiety and despondency about his fate and about the whole course of the undertaking would have been obviated. The Beaver would have received the furs collected at the factory and taken them to Canton, and great gains, instead of great losses, would have been the result. The greatest blunder, however, was that committed by Captain Soule. At length, about the 20th of June, the ship Albatross, Captain Smith, arrived from China and brought the first tidings of the war to the Sandwich Islands. Mr. Hunt was no longer in doubt and perplexity as to the reason of the non-appearance of the annual ship. His first thoughts were for the welfare of Astoria, and concluding that the inhabitants would probably be in want of provisions, he chartered the Albatross for $2,000 to land him with some supplies at the mouth of the Columbia, where he arrived, as we have seen, on the 20th of August, after a year's seafaring that might have furnished a chapter in the wanderings of Sinbad. End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arrangements among the partners. Mr. Hunt sails in the Albatross, arrives at the Marquesas. News of the frigate Phoebe. Mr. Hunt proceeds to the Sandwich Islands. Voyage of the Lark, her shipwreck. Transactions with the natives of the Sandwich Islands. Conduct of Kamehameha. Mr. Hunt was overwhelmed with surprise when he learnt the resolution taken by the partners to abandon Astoria. He soon found, however, that matters had gone too far, and the minds of his colleagues had become too firmly bent upon the measure to render any opposition of avail. He was beset, too, with the same disparaging accounts of the interior trade and of the whole concerns and prospects of the company that had been rendered to Mr. Astor. His own experience had been full of perplexities and discouragements. He had a conscientious anxiety for the interests of Mr. Astor, and not comprehending the extended views of that gentleman and his habit of operating with great amounts, he had from the first been daunted by the enormous expenses required, and had become disheartened by the subsequent losses sustained, which appeared to him to be ruinous in their magnitude. By degrees, therefore, he was brought to acquiesce in the step taken by his colleagues, as perhaps advisable in the exigencies of the case. His only care was to wind up the business with as little further loss as possible to Mr. Astor. A large stock of valuable furs was collected at the factory, which it was necessary to get to a market. There were 25 Sandwich Islanders also in the employ of the company, whom they were bound by express agreement to restore to their native country. For these purposes a ship was necessary. The Albatross was bound to the Marquesas, and thence to the Sandwich Islands. It was resolved that Mr. Hunt should sail in her in quest of a vessel, and should return, if possible, by the 1st of January, bringing with him a supply of provisions. Should anything occur, however, to prevent his return, an arrangement was to be proposed to Mr. McTavish to transfer such of the men as were so disposed from the service of the American Fur Company into that of the Northwest, the latter becoming responsible for the wages due them on receiving an equivalent in goods from the storehouse of the factory. As a means of facilitating the dispatch of business, Mr. McDougall proposed that in case Mr. Hunt should not return, the whole arrangement with Mr. McTavish should be left solely to him. This was assented to, the contingency being considered possible, but not probable. It is proper to note that on the first announcement by Mr. McDougall of his intention to break up the establishment, 3 of the clerks, British subjects, had, with his consent, passed into the service of the Northwest Company, and departed with Mr. McTavish for his post in the interior. Having arranged all these matters during the sojourn of 6 days at Astoria, Mr. Hunt set sail in the Albatross on the 26th of August, and arrived without incident at the Marquesas. He had not been there long when Porter arrived in the frigate Essex, bringing in a number of stout London whalers as prizes, having made a sweeping cruise in the Pacific. From Commodore Porter he received the alarming intelligence that the British frigate Phoebe, with a store ship mounted with battering pieces, calculated to attack forts, had arrived at Rio Janeiro, where she had been joined by the sloops of war Cherub and Raccoon, and that they had all sailed in company on the 6th of July for the Pacific, bound, as it was supposed, to Columbia River. Here, then, was the death warrant of unfortunate Astoria. The anxious mind of Mr. Hunt was in greater perplexity than ever. He had been eager to extricate the property of Mr. Astor from a failing concern with as little loss as possible. There was now danger that the whole would be swallowed up. How was it to be snatched from the gulf? It was impossible to charter a ship for the purpose, now that a British squadron was on its way to the river. He applied to purchase one of the whale ships brought in by Commodore Porter. The Commodore demanded $25,000 for her. The price appeared exorbitant, and no bargain could be made. Mr. Hunt then urged the Commodore to fit out one of his prizes and send her to Astoria to bring off the property and part of the people, but he declined from want of authority. He assured Mr. Hunt, however, that he would endeavor to fall in with the enemy, or should he hear of their having certainly gone to the Columbia, he would either follow or anticipate them, should his circumstances warrant such a step. In this tantalizing state of suspense, Mr. Hunt was detained at the Marquesas until November 23rd, when he proceeded in the Albatross to the Sandwich Islands. He still cherished a faint hope that, notwithstanding the war and all other discouraging circumstances, the annual ship might have been sent by Mr. Astor and might have touched at the islands and proceeded to the Columbia. He knew the pride and interest taken by that gentleman in his great enterprise, and that he would not be deterred by dangers and difficulties from prosecuting it. Much less would he leave the infant establishment without succor and support in the time of trouble. In this, we have seen, he did but justice to Mr. Astor, and we must now turn to notice the cause of the non-arrival of the vessel which he had dispatched with reinforcements and supplies. Her voyage forms another chapter of accidents in this eventful story. The Lark sailed from New York on the 6th of March, 1813, and proceeded prosperously on her voyage until within a few degrees of the Sandwich Islands. Here a gale sprang up that soon blew with tremendous violence. The Lark was a staunch and noble ship, and for a time buffeted bravely with the storm. Unluckily, however, she breached to, and was struck by a heavy sea that hove her on her beam ends. The helm, too, was knocked to leeward. All command of the vessel was lost, and another mountain wave completely overset her. Orders were given to cut away the masts. In the hurry and confusion, the boats also were unfortunately cut adrift. The wreck then righted, but was a mere hulk, full of water, with a heavy sea washing over it, and all the hatches off. On mustering the crew, one man was missing, who was discovered below in the forecastle, drowned. In cutting away the masts, it had been utterly impossible to observe the necessary precaution of commencing with the lee rigging, that being, from the position of the ship, completely under water. The masts and spars, therefore, being linked to the wreck by the shrouds and the rigging, remained alongside for 4 days. During all this time the ship lay rolling in the trough of the sea, the heavy surges breaking over her, and the spars heaving and banging to and fro, bruising the half-drowned sailors that clung to the bowsprit and the stumps of the masts. The sufferings of these poor fellows were intolerable. They stood to their waists in water, in imminent peril of being washed off by every surge. In this position they dared not sleep, lest they should let go their hold and be swept away. The only dry place on the wreck was the bowsprit. Here they took turns to be tied on for half an hour at a time, and in this way gained short snatches of sleep. On the 14th, the first mate died at his post and was swept off by the surges. On the 17th, 2 seamen, faint and exhausted, were washed overboard. The next wave threw their bodies back upon the deck, where they remained, swashing backward and forward, ghastly objects to the almost perishing survivors. Mr. Ogden, the supercargo, who was at the bowsprit, called to the men nearest to the bodies to fasten them to the wreck, as a last horrible resource in case of being driven to extremity by famine. On the 17th, the gale gradually subsided, and the sea became calm. The sailors now crawled feebly about the wreck, and began to relieve it from the main encumbrances. The spars were cleared away, the anchors and guns heaved overboard, the spritsail yard was rigged for a jury mast, and a mizzen topsail set upon it. A sort of stage was made of a few broken spars, on which the crew were raised above the surface of the water, so as to be enabled to keep themselves dry and to sleep comfortably. Still, their sufferings from hunger and thirst were great. But there was a Sandwich Islander on board, an expert swimmer, who found his way into the cabin, and occasionally brought up a few bottles of wine and porter, and at length got into the rum, and secured a quarter cask of wine. A little raw pork was likewise procured, and dealt out with a sparing hand. The horrors of their situation were increased by the sight of numerous sharks prowling about the wreck, as if waiting for their prey. On the 24th, the cook, a black man, died and was cast into the sea, when he was instantly seized on by these ravenous monsters. They had been several days making slow headway under scanty sail, when on the 25th they came in sight of land. It was about 15 leagues distant, and they remained 2 or 3 days drifting along in sight of it. On the 28th they descried, to their great transport, a canoe approaching, managed by natives. They came alongside and brought a most welcome supply of potatoes. They informed them that the land they had made was one of the Sandwich Islands. The second mate and one of the seamen went on shore in the canoe for water and provisions, and to procure aid from the islanders in towing the wreck into a harbor. Neither of the men returned, nor was any assistance sent from shore. The next day 10 or 12 canoes came alongside, but roamed around the wreck like so many sharks, and would render no aid in towing her to land. The sea continued to break over the vessel with such violence that it was impossible to stand at the helm without the assistance of lashings. The crew were now so worn down by famine and thirst that the captain saw it would be impossible for them to withstand the breaking of the sea when the ship should ground. He deemed the only chance for their lives, therefore, was to get to land in the canoes, and stand ready to receive and protect the wreck when she should drift ashore. Accordingly, they all got safe to land, but had scarcely touched the beach when they were surrounded by the natives, who stripped them almost naked. The name of this inhospitable island was Tahuroa. In the course of the night, the wreck came drifting to the strand, with the surf thundering round her, and shortly afterwards bilged. On the following morning, numerous casks of provisions floated on shore. The natives staved them for the sake of the iron hoops, but would not allow the crew to help themselves to the contents, or to go on board of the wreck. As the crew were in want of everything, and as it might be a long time before any opportunity occurred for them to get away from these islands, Mr. Ogden, as soon as he could get a chance, made his way to the island of Owaihi and endeavored to make some arrangement with the king for the relief of his companions in misfortune. The illustrious Kamehameha, as we have shown on a former occasion, was a shrewd bargainer, and in the present instance proved himself an experienced wrecker. His negotiations with McDougall and the other heiries of the great American Fur Company had but little effect on present circumstances, and he proceeded to avail himself of their misfortunes. He agreed to furnish the crew with provisions during their stay in his territories, and to return to them all their clothing that could be found, but he stipulated that the wreck should be abandoned to him as a waif cast by fortune on his shores. With these conditions Mr. Ogden was fain to comply. Upon this, the great Kamehameha deputed his favorite, John Young, the tarpaulin governor of Owaihi, to proceed with a number of royal guards and take possession of the wreck on behalf of the crown. This was done accordingly, and the property and crew were removed to Owaihi. The royal bounty appears to have been but scanty in its dispensations. The crew fared but meagerly, though, on reading the journal of the voyage, it is singular to find them, after all the hardships they had suffered, so sensitive about petty inconveniences, as to exclaim against the king as a savage monster for refusing them a pot to cook in, or denying Mr. Ogden the use of a knife and fork which had been saved from the wreck. Such was the unfortunate catastrophe of the Lark. Had she reached her destination in safety, affairs at Astoria might have taken a different course. A strange fatality seems to have attended all the expeditions by sea, nor were those by land much less disastrous. Captain Northrop was still at the Sandwich Islands on December 20th when Mr. Hunt arrived. The latter immediately purchased, for $10,000, a brig called the Peddler, and put Captain Northrop in command of her. They set sail for Astoria on the 22nd of January, intending to remove the property from thence as speedily as possible to the Russian settlements on the northwest coast, to prevent it from falling into the hands of the British. Such were the orders of Mr. Astor sent out by the Lark. We will now leave Mr. Hunt on his voyage and return to see what has taken place at Astoria during his absence. End of chapter 58. Chapter 59 of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arrival of McTavish at Astoria. Conduct of his followers. Negotiations of McDougall and McTavish. Bargain for the transfer of Astoria. Doubts entertained of the loyalty of McDougall. On the 2nd of October, about 5 weeks after Mr. Hunt had sailed in the Albatross from Astoria, Mr. Mackenzie set off with 2 canoes and 12 men for the posts of Messrs. Stuart and Clark to appraise them of the new arrangements determined upon in the recent conference of the partners at the factory. He had not ascended the river 100 miles when he met a squadron of 10 canoes sweeping merrily down under British colors, the Canadian oarsmen, as usual, in full song. It was an armament fitted out by McTavish, who had with him Mr. J. Stuart, another partner of the Northwest Company, together with some clerks and 68 men, 75 souls in all. They had heard of the frigate Phoebe and the Isaac Todd being on the high seas, and were on their way down to await their arrival. In one of their canoes, Mr. Clark came as a passenger, the alarming intelligence having brought him down from his post on the Spokane. Mr. Mackenzie immediately determined to return with him to Astoria, and veering about, the two parties encamped together for the night. The leaders, of course, observed a due decorum, but some of the subalterns could not restrain their chuckling exultation, boasting that they would soon plant the British standard on the walls of Astoria and drive the Americans out of the country. In the course of the evening, Mr. Mackenzie had a secret conference with Mr. Clark, in which they agreed to set off privately before daylight and get down in time to apprise MacDougall of the approach of these Northwesters. The latter, however, were completely on the alert. Just as Mackenzie's canoes were about to push off, they were joined by a couple from the Northwest Squadron, in which was McTavish with 2 clerks and 11 men. With these he intended to push forward and make arrangements, leaving the rest of the convoy, in which was a large quantity of furs, to await his orders. The 2 parties arrived at Astoria on the 7th of October. The Northwesters encamped under the guns of the fort and displayed the British colors. The young men in the fort, natives of the United States, were on the point of hoisting the American flag, but were forbidden by Mr. MacDougall. They were astonished at such a prohibition, and were exceedingly galled by the tone and manner assumed by the clerks and retainers of the Northwest Company, who ruffled about in that swelling and braggart style which grows up among these heroes of the wilderness. They, in fact, considered themselves lords of the ascendant, and regarded the hampered and harassed Astorians as a conquered people. On the following day, MacDougall convened the clerks and read to them an extract from a letter from his uncle, Mr. Angus Shaw, one of the principal partners of the Northwest Company, announcing the coming of the Phoebe and Isaac Todd to take and destroy everything American on the Northwest coast. This intelligence was received without dismay by such of the clerks as were natives of the United States. They had felt indignant at seeing their national flag struck by a Canadian commander, and the British flag flowed, as it were, in their faces. They had been stung to the quick, also, by the vaunting airs assumed by the Northwesters. In this mood of mind, they would willingly have nailed their colors to the staff and defied the frigate. She could not come within many miles of the fort, they observed, and any boat she might send could be destroyed by their cannon. There were cooler and more calculating spirits, however, who had the control of affairs, and felt nothing of the patriotic pride and indignation of these youths. The extract of the letter had apparently been read by MacDougall merely to prepare the way for a preconcerted stroke of management. On the same day, Mr. McTavish proposed to purchase the whole stock of goods and furs belonging to the company, both at Astoria and in the interior, at cost and charges. Mr. MacDougall undertook to comply, assuming the whole management of the negotiation in virtue of the power vested in him, in case of the non-arrival of Mr. Hunt. That power, however, was limited and specific, and did not extend to an operation of this nature and extent. No objection, however, was made to his assumption, and he and McTavish soon made a preliminary arrangement perfectly satisfactory to the latter. Mr. Stuart and the reserve party of Northwesters arrived shortly afterwards and encamped with McTavish. The former exclaimed loudly against the terms of the arrangement and insisted upon a reduction of the prices. New negotiations had now to be entered into. The demands of the Northwesters were made in a peremptory tone, and they seemed disposed to dictate like conquerors. The Americans looked on with indignation and impatience. They considered MacDougall as acting, if not a perfidious, certainly a craven part. He was continually repairing to the camp to negotiate, instead of keeping within his walls and receiving overtures in his fortress. His case, they observed, was not so desperate as to excuse such crouching. He might, in fact, hold out for his own terms. The Northwest party had lost their ammunition, they had no goods to trade with the natives for provisions, and they were so destitute that MacDougall had absolutely to feed them, while he negotiated with them. He, on the contrary, was well lodged and victualled, had 60 men with arms, ammunition, boats, and everything requisite, either for defence or retreat. The party, beneath the guns of his fort, were at his mercy. Should an enemy appear in the offing, he could pack up the most valuable part of the property and retire to some place of concealment, or make off for the interior. These considerations, however, had no weight with Mr. MacDougall, or were overruled by other motives. The terms of sale were lowered by him to the standard fixed by Mr. Stuart, and an agreement executed on the 16th of October, by which the furs and merchandise of all kinds in the country belonging to Mr. Astor passed into the possession of the Northwest Company at about a third of their value. A safe passage through the Northwest posts was guaranteed to such as did not choose to enter into the service of that company, and the amount of wages due to them was to be deducted from the price paid for Astoria. The conduct and motives of Mr. MacDougall throughout the whole of this proceeding have been strongly questioned by the other partners. He has been accused of availing himself of a wrong construction of powers vested in him at his own request, and of sacrificing the interests of Mr. Astor to the Northwest Company under the promise or hope of advantage to himself. He always insisted, however, that he made the best bargain for Mr. Astor that circumstances would permit, the frigate being hourly expected, in which case the whole property of that gentleman would be liable to capture, that the return of Mr. Hunt was problematical, the frigate intending to cruise along the coast for 2 years and clear it of all American vessels. He moreover averred, and McTavish corroborated his averment by certificate, that he proposed an arrangement to that gentleman by which the furs were to be sent to Canton and sold there at Mr. Astor's risk and for his account, but the proposition was not acceded to. Notwithstanding all his representations, several of the persons present at the transaction and acquainted with the whole course of the affair, and among the number Mr. Mackenzie himself, his occasional coadjutor, remained firm in the belief that he had acted a hollow part. Neither did he succeed in exculpating himself to Mr. Astor, that gentleman declaring, in a letter written some time afterwards to Mr. Hunt, that he considered the property virtually given away. "Had our place and our property," he adds, "been fairly captured, I should have preferred it. I should not feel as if I were disgraced." All these may be unmerited suspicions, but it certainly is a circumstance strongly corroborative of them that Mr. MacDougall, shortly after concluding this agreement, became a member of the Northwest Company and received a share, productive of a handsome income. Footnote: Not quite $40,000 were allowed for furs worth upwards of $100,000. Beaver was valued at $2 per skin, though worth $5. Land otter at 50 cents, though worth $5. Sea otter at $12, worth from $45 to $60. And for several kinds of furs nothing was allowed. Moreover, the goods and merchandise for the Indian trade ought to have brought 3 times the amount for which they were sold. The following estimate has been made of the articles on hand and the prices. 17,705 pounds beaver parchment, valued at $2, worth $5. 465 old coat beaver, valued at $1.66, worth $3.50. 907 land otter, valued at 50 cents, worth $5. 68 sea otter, valued at $12, worth $45 to $60. 30 sea otter, valued at $5, worth $25. Nothing was allowed for 179 mink skins, worth each 40 cents. 22 raccoon, worth each 40 cents. 28 lynx, worth each $2. 18 fox, worth each $1. 106 fox, worth each $1.50. 71 black bear, worth each $4. 16 grizzly bear, worth each $10. End of chapter 59. Chapter 60 of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arrival of a strange sail. Agitation at Astoria. Warlike offer of Comcomly. Astoria taken possession of by the British. Indignation of Comcomly at the conduct of his son-in-law. On the morning of the 30th of November, a sail was descried doubling Cape Disappointment. It came to anchor in Baker's Bay and proved to be a ship of war. Of what nation? Was now the anxious inquiry. If English, why did it come alone? Where was the merchant vessel that was to have accompanied it? If American, what was to become of the newly acquired possession of the Northwest Company? In this dilemma, McTavish, in all haste, loaded 2 barges with all the packages of furs bearing the mark of the Northwest Company, and made off for Tongue Point, 3 miles up the river. There he was to await a preconcerted signal from McDougall on ascertaining the character of the ship. If it should prove American, McTavish would have a fair start, and could bear off his rich cargo to the interior. It is singular that this prompt mode of conveying valuable but easily transportable effects beyond the reach of a hostile ship should not have suggested itself while the property belonged to Mr. Astor. In the meantime, McDougall, who still remained nominal chief at the fort, launched a canoe, manned by men recently in the employ of the American Fur Company, and steered for the ship. On the way, he instructed his men to pass themselves for Americans or Englishmen according to the exigencies of the case. The vessel proved to be the British sloop of war Raccoon, of 26 guns and 120 men, commanded by Captain Black. According to the account of that officer, the frigate Phoebe and 2 sloops of war, Cherub and Raccoon, had sailed in convoy of the Isaac Todd from Rio Janeiro. On board of the Phoebe, Mr. John MacDonald, a partner of the Northwest Company, embarked as passenger to profit by the anticipated catastrophe at Astoria. The convoy was separated by stress of weather off Cape Horn. The 3 ships of war came together again at the island of Juan Fernandez, their appointed rendezvous, but waited in vain for the Isaac Todd. In the meantime, intelligence was received of the mischief that Commodore Porter was doing among the British whale ships. Commodore Hillyer immediately set sail in quest of him with the Phoebe and the Cherub, transferring Mr. MacDonald to the Raccoon, and ordered that vessel to proceed to the Columbia. The officers of the Raccoon were in high spirits. The agents of the Northwest Company, in instigating the expedition, had talked of immense booty to be made by the fortunate captors of Astoria. Mr. MacDonald had kept up the excitement during the voyage so that not a midshipman but revelled in dreams of ample prize money, nor a lieutenant that would have sold his chance for 1,000 pounds. Their disappointment, therefore, may easily be conceived when they learned that their warlike attack upon Astoria had been forestalled by a snug commercial arrangement, that their anticipated booty had become British property in the regular course of traffic, and that all this had been effected by the very company which had been instrumental in getting them sent on what they now stigmatized as a fool's errand. They felt as if they had been duped and made tools of by a set of shrewd men of traffic, who had employed them to crack the nut while they carried off the kernel. In a word, MacDougall found himself so ungraciously received by his countrymen on board of the ship that he was glad to cut short his visit and return to shore. He was busy at the fort, making preparations for the reception of the captain of the Raccoon, when his one-eyed Indian father-in-law made his appearance, with a train of Chinook warriors, all painted and equipped in warlike style. Old Concomly had beheld with dismay the arrival of the big war canoe, displaying the British flag. The shrewd old savage had become something of a politician in the course of his daily visits at the fort. He knew of the war existing between the nations, but knew nothing of the arrangement between MacDougall and MacTavish. He trembled, therefore, for the power of his white son-in-law and the new-fledged grandeur of his daughter, and assembled his warriors in all haste. "King George," said he, "has sent his great canoe to destroy the fort and make slaves of all the inhabitants. Shall we suffer it? The Americans are the first white men that have fixed themselves in the land. They have treated us like brothers. Their great chief has taken my daughter to be his squaw. We are therefore as one people." His warriors had all determined to stand by the Americans to the last, and to this effect they came painted and armed for battle. Comcomly made a spirited war speech to his son-in-law. He offered to kill every one of King George's men that should attempt to land. It was an easy matter. The ship could not approach within 6 miles of the fort. The crew could only land in boats. The woods reached to the water's edge. In these he and his warriors would conceal themselves and shoot down the enemy as fast as they put foot on shore. MacDougall was doubtless properly sensible of this parental devotion on the part of his savage father-in-law, and perhaps a little rebuked by the game spirit, so opposite to his own. He assured Concomly, however, that his solicitude for the safety of himself and the princess was superfluous, as, though the ship belonged to King George, her crew would not injure the Americans or their Indian allies. He advised him and his warriors, therefore, to lay aside their weapons and war shirts, wash off the paint from their faces and bodies, and appear like clean and civil savages, to receive the strangers courteously. Comcomly was sorely puzzled at this advice, which accorded so little with his Indian notions of receiving a hostile nation, and it was only after repeated and positive assurances of the amicable intentions of the strangers that he was induced to lower his fighting tone. He said something to his warriors explanatory of this singular posture of affairs, and in vindication, perhaps, of the pacific temper of his son-in-law. They all gave a shrug and an Indian grunt of acquiescence, and went off sulkily to their village to lay aside their weapons for the present. The proper arrangements being made for the reception of Captain Black, that officer caused his ship's boats to be manned and landed with befitting state at Astoria. From the talk that had been made by the Northwest Company of the strength of the place and the armament they had required to assist in its reduction, he expected to find a fortress of some importance. When he beheld nothing but stockades and bastions, calculated for defense against naked savages, he felt an emotion of indignant surprise, mingled with something of the ludicrous. "Is this the fort," cried he, "about which I have heard so much talking? Me, but I'd better batter it down in 2 hours with a 4-pounder. When he learned, however, the amount of rich furs that had been passed into the hands of the Northwesters, he was outrageous, and insisted that an inventory should be taken of all the property purchased of the Americans. with a view to ulterior measures in England for the recovery of the value from the Northwest Company. As he grew cool, however, he gave over all idea of preferring such a claim, and reconciled himself, as well as he could, to the idea of having been forestalled by his bargaining coadjutors. On the 12th of December, the fate of Astoria was consummated by a regular ceremonial. Captain Black, attended by his officers, entered the fort, caused the British standard to be erected, broke a bottle of wine, and declared in a loud voice that he took possession of the establishment and of the country in the name of His Britannic Majesty, changing the name of Astoria to that of Fort George. The Indian warriors who had offered their services to repel the strangers were present on this occasion. It was explained to them as being a friendly arrangement and transfer, but they shook their heads grimly and considered it an act of subjugation of their ancient allies. They regretted that they had complied with MacDougall's wishes in laying aside their arms, and remarked that, however the Americans might conceal the fact, they were undoubtedly all slaves, nor could they be persuaded of the contrary until they beheld the raccoon depart without taking away any prisoners. As to Comcomly, he no longer prided himself upon his white son-in-law, but whenever he was asked about him, shook his head and replied that his daughter had made a mistake, and instead of getting a great warrior for a husband, had married herself to a squaw. End of chapter 60. Chapter 61 of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains, by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arrival of the brig Peddler at Astoria. Breaking up of the establishment. Departure of several of the company. Tragical story told by the squaw of Pierre Dorion. Fate of Reed and his companions. Attempts of Mr. Astor to renew his enterprise. Disappointment. Concluding observations and reflection. Having given the catastrophe at the fort of Astoria, it remains now but to gather up a few loose ends of this widely excursive narrative and conclude. On the 28th of February, the brig Peddler anchored in Columbia River. It will be recollected that Mr. Hunt had purchased this vessel at the Sandwich Islands to take off the furs collected at the factory and to restore the Sandwich Islanders to their homes. When that gentleman learned, however, the precipitate and summary manner in which the property had been bargained away by MacDougall, he expressed his indignation in the strongest terms, and determined to make an effort to get back the furs. As soon as his wishes were known in this respect, MacDougall came to sound him on behalf of the Northwest Company, intimating that he had no doubt the peltries might be repurchased at an advance of 50%. This overture was not calculated to soothe the angry feelings of Mr. Hunt, and his indignation was complete when he discovered that MacDougall had become a partner of the Northwest Company, and had actually been so since the 23rd of December. He had kept his partnership a secret, however, had retained the papers of the Pacific Fur Company in his possession, and had continued to act as Mr. Astor's agent, though two of the partners of the other company, Mr. Mackenzie and Mr. Clark, were present. He had, moreover, divulged to his new associates all that he knew as to Mr. Astor's plans and affairs, and had made copies of his business letters for their perusal. Mr. Hunt now considered the whole conduct of MacDougall hollow and collusive. His only thought was, therefore, to get all the papers of the concern out of his hands, and bring the business to a close, for the interests of Mr. Astor were yet completely at stake, the drafts of the Northwest Company in his favor for the purchase money not having yet been obtained. With some difficulty he succeeded in getting possession of the papers. The bills or drafts were delivered without hesitation. The latter he remitted to Mr. Astor by some of his associates who were about to cross the continent to New York. This done, he embarked on board the Peddler on the 3rd of April, accompanied by 2 of the clerks, Mr. Seaton and Mr. Halsey, and bade a final adieu to Astoria. The next day, April 4th, Messrs. Clark, Mackenzie, David Stuart, and such of the Astorians as had not entered into the service of the Northwest Company set out to cross the Rocky Mountains. It is not our intention to take the reader another journey across those rugged barriers, but we will step forward with the travelers to a distance on their way, merely to relate their interview with a character already noted in this work. As the party were proceeding up the Columbia, near the mouth of the Walla Walla River, several Indian canoes put off from the shore to overtake them, and a voice called upon them in French and requested them to stop. They accordingly put to shore, and were joined by those in the canoes. To their surprise, they recognized in the person who had hailed them the Indian wife of Pierre Dorion, accompanied by her 2 children. She had a story to tell involving the fate of several of our unfortunate adventurers. Mr. John Reed, the Hibernian, it will be remembered, had been detached during the summer to the Snake River. His party consisted of 4 Canadians, Gilles Leclerc, François Landry, Jean-Baptiste Turcot, and André Lachapelle, together with 2 hunters, Pierre Dorion and Pierre Delaunay. Dorion, as usual, being accompanied by his wife and children. The objects of this expedition were twofold: to trap beaver and to search for the 3 hunters, Robinson, Hoback, and Resner. In the course of the autumn, Reed lost 1 man, Landry, by death. Another one, Pierre Delaunay, who was of a sullen, perverse disposition, left him in a moody fit, and was never heard of afterwards. The number of his party was not, however, reduced by these losses, as the 3 hunters, Robinson, Hoback, and Resner, had joined it. Reed now built a house on the Snake River for their winter quarters, which being completed, the party set about trapping. Resner, Leclerc, and Pierre Dorion went about 5 days' journey from the wintering house to a part of the country well stocked with beaver. Here they put up a hut and proceeded to trap, with great success. While the men were out hunting, Pierre Dorion's wife remained at home to dress the skins and prepare the meals. She was thus employed one evening about the beginning of January, cooking the supper of the hunters, when she heard footsteps, and Leclerc staggered, pale and bleeding, into the hut. He informed her that a party of savages had surprised them while at their traps, and had killed Resner and her husband. He had barely strength left to give this information when he sank upon the ground. The poor woman saw that the only chance for life was instant flight, but in this exigency showed that presence of mind and force of character for which she had frequently been noted. With great difficulty she caught 2 of the horses belonging to the party. Then, collecting her clothes and a small quantity of beaver meat and dried salmon, she packed them upon one of the horses, and helped the wounded man to mount upon it. On the other horse she mounted with her 2 children, and hurried away from this dangerous neighborhood, directing her flight to Mr. Reed's establishment. On the 3rd day she descried a number of Indians on horseback proceeding in an easterly direction. She immediately dismounted with her children, and helped Leclerc likewise to dismount, and all concealed themselves. Fortunately, they escaped the sharp eyes of the savages, but had to proceed with the utmost caution. That night they slept without fire or water. She managed to keep her children warm in her arms, but before morning poor Leclerc died. With the dawn of day the resolute woman resumed her course, and on the 4th day reached the house of Mr. Reed. It was deserted, and all round were marks of blood and signs of a furious massacre. Not doubting that Mr. Reed and his party had all fallen victims, she turned in fresh horror from the spot. For 2 days she continued hurrying forward, ready to sink for want of food, but more solicitous about her children than herself. At length she reached a range of the Rocky Mountains, near the upper part of the Walla Walla River. Here she chose a wild, lonely ravine as her place of winter refuge. She had fortunately a buffalo robe and 3 deerskins. Of these, and of pine bark and cedar branches, she constructed a rude wigwam, which she pitched beside a mountain spring. Having no other food, she killed the 2 horses and smoked their flesh. The skins aided to cover her hut. Here she dragged out the winter, with no other company than her 2 children. Towards the middle of March her provisions were nearly exhausted. She therefore packed up the remainder, slung it on her back, and, with her helpless little ones, set out again on her wanderings. Crossing the ridge of mountains, she descended to the banks of the Walla Walla, and kept along them until she arrived where that river throws itself into the Columbia. She was hospitably received and entertained by the Walla Wallas, and had been nearly 2 weeks among them when the 2 canoes passed. On being interrogated, she could assign no reason for this murderous attack of the savages. It appeared to be perfectly wanton and unprovoked. Some of the Astorians supposed it an act of butchery by a roving band of Blackfeet. Others, however, and with greater probability of correctness, have ascribed it to the tribe of Pierced-Nose Indians, in revenge for the death of their comrade, hanged by order of Mr. Clark. If so, it shows that these sudden and apparently wanton outbreakings of sanguinary violence on the part of the savages have often some previous, though perhaps remote, provocation. The narrative of the Indian woman closes the checkered adventures of some of the personages of this motley story, such as the honest Hibernian Reed and Dorion the hybrid interpreter. Turcot and La Chapelle were 2 of the men who fell off from Mr. Crooks in the course of his wintry journey, and had subsequently such disastrous times among the Indians. We cannot but feel some sympathy with that persevering trio of Kentuckians, Robinson, Resner, and Hoback, who twice turned back when on their way homeward, and lingered in the wilderness to perish by the hands of savages. The return parties from Astoria, both by sea and land, experienced on the way as many adventures, vicissitudes, and mishaps as the far-famed heroes of the Odyssey. They reached their destination at different times, bearing tidings to Mr. Astor of the unfortunate termination of his enterprise. That gentleman, however, was not disposed, even yet, to give the matter up as lost. On the contrary, his spirit was roused by what he considered ungenerous and unmerited conduct on the part of the Northwest Company. "After their treatment of me," said he in a letter to Mr. Hunt, "I have no idea of remaining quiet and idle." He determined, therefore, as soon as circumstances would permit, to resume his enterprise. At the return of peace, Astoria, with the adjacent country, reverted to the United States by the Treaty of Ghent, on the principle of status ante bellum, and Captain Biddle was dispatched in the sloop of war Ontario to take formal possession. In the winter of 1815, a law was passed by Congress prohibiting all traffic of British traders within the territories of the United States. The favorable moment seemed now to Mr. Astor to have arrived for the revival of his favorite enterprise. But new difficulties had grown up to impede it. The Northwest Company were now in complete occupation of the Columbia River and its chief tributary streams, holding the posts which he had established, and carrying on a trade throughout the neighboring region, in defiance of the prohibitory law of Congress, which in effect was a dead letter beyond the mountains. To dispossess them would be an undertaking of almost a belligerent nature, for their agents and retainers were well armed and skilled in the use of weapons, as is usual with Indian traders. The ferocious and bloody contests which had taken place between the rival trading parties of the Northwest and Hudson's Bay companies had shown what might be expected from commercial feuds in the lawless depths of the wilderness. Mr. Astor did not think it advisable, therefore, to attempt the matter without the protection of the American flag, under which his people might rally in case of need. He accordingly made an informal overture to the President of the United States, Mr. Madison, through Mr. Gallatin, offering to renew his enterprise and to reestablish Astoria, provided it would be protected by the American flag and made a military post, stating that the whole force required would not exceed a lieutenant's command. The application, approved and recommended by Mr. Gallatin, one of the most enlightened statesmen of our country, was favorably received, but no step was taken in consequence, the President not being disposed, in all probability, to commit himself by any direct countenance or overt act. Discouraged by this supineness on the part of the government, Mr. Astor did not think fit to renew his overtures in a more formal manner, and the favorable moment for the reoccupation of Astoria was suffered to pass unimproved. The British trading establishments were thus enabled, without molestation, to strike deep their roots and extend their ramifications, in despite of the prohibition of Congress, until they had spread themselves over the rich field of enterprise opened by Mr. Astor. The British government soon began to perceive the importance of this region and to desire to include it within their territorial domains. A question has consequently risen as to the right to the soil, and has become one of the most perplexing now open between the United States and Great Britain. In the first treaty relative to it, under date of October 20th, 1818, the question was left unsettled, and it was agreed that the country on the northwest coast of America, westward of the Rocky Mountains, claimed by either nation, should be open to the inhabitants of both for 10 years, for the purpose of trade, with the equal right of navigating all its rivers. When these 10 years had expired, a subsequent treaty in 1828 extended the arrangement to 10 additional years. So the matter stands at present. On casting back our eyes over the series of events we have recorded, we see no reason to attribute the failure of this great commercial undertaking to any fault in the scheme or omission in the execution of it on the part of the projector. It was a magnificent enterprise, well concerted and carried on, without regard to difficulties or expense. A succession of adverse circumstances and cross-purposes, however, beset it almost from the outset, some of them, in fact, arising from neglect of the orders and instructions of Mr. Astor. The first crippling blow was the loss of the Tonquin, which clearly would not have happened had Mr. Astor's earnest injunctions with regard to the natives been attended to. Had this ship performed her voyage prosperously and revisited Astoria in due time, the trade of the establishment would have taken its preconcerted course, and the spirits of all concerned been kept up by a confident prospect of success. Her dismal catastrophe struck a chill into every heart and prepared the way for subsequent despondency. Another cause of embarrassment and loss was the departure from the plan of Mr. Astor as to the voyage of the Beaver, subsequent to her visiting Astoria. The variation from this plan produced a series of cross-purposes, disastrous to the establishment, and detained Mr. Hunt absent from his post, when his presence there was of vital importance to the enterprise. So essential is it for an agent in any great and complicated undertaking to execute faithfully and to the letter the part marked out for him by the master mind which has concerted the whole. The breaking out of the war between the United States and Great Britain multiplied the hazards and embarrassments of the enterprise. The disappointment as to convoy rendered it difficult to keep up reinforcements and supplies, and the loss of the Lark added to the tissue of misadventures. That Mr. Astor battled resolutely against every difficulty and pursued his course in defiance of every loss has been sufficiently shown. Had he been seconded by suitable agents and properly protected by government, the ultimate failure of his plan might yet have been averted. It was his great misfortune that his agents were not imbued with his spirit. Some had not capacity sufficient to comprehend the real nature and extent of his scheme. Others were alien in feeling and interest, and had been brought up in the service of a rival company. Whatever sympathies they might originally have had with him were impaired, if not destroyed, by the war. They looked upon his cause as desperate, and only considered how they might make interest to regain a situation under their former employers. The absence of Mr. Hunt, the only real representative of Mr. Astor, at the time of the capitulation with the Northwest Company, completed the series of cross-purposes. Had that gentleman been present, the transfer, in all probability, would not have taken place. It is painful at all times to see a grand and beneficial stroke of genius fall of its aim, but we regret the failure of this enterprise in a national point of view, for had it been crowned with success, it would have redounded greatly to the advantage and extension of our commerce. The profits drawn from the country in question by the British Fur Company, though of ample amount, form no criterion by which to judge of the advantages that would have arisen had it been entirely in the hands of the citizens of the United States. That company, as has been shown, is limited in the nature and scope of its operations, and can make but little use of the maritime facilities held out by an emporium and a harbor on that coast. In our hands, besides the roving bands of trappers and traders, the country would have been explored and settled by industrious husbandmen, and the fertile valleys bordering its rivers and shut up among its mountains would have been made to pour forth their agricultural treasures to contribute to the general wealth. In respect to commerce, we should have had a line of trading posts from the Mississippi and the Missouri across the Rocky Mountains, forming a high road from the great regions of the West to the shores of the Pacific. We should have had a fortified post and port at the mouth of the Columbia, commanding the trade of that river and its tributaries, and of a wide extent of country and sea-coast, carrying on an active and profitable commerce with the Sandwich Islands, and a direct and frequent communication with China. In a word, Astoria might have realized the anticipations of Mr. Astor, so well understood and appreciated by Mr. Jefferson, in gradually becoming a commercial empire beyond the mountains, peopled by free and independent Americans, and linked with us by ties of blood and interest. We repeat, therefore, our sincere regret that our government should have neglected the overture of Mr. Astor and suffered the moment to pass by, when full possession of this region might have been taken quietly, as a matter of course, and a military post established, without dispute, at Astoria. Our statesmen have become sensible, when too late, of the importance of this measure. Bills have repeatedly been brought into Congress for the purpose, but without success, and our rightful possessions on that coast, as well as our trade on the Pacific, have no rallying point protected by the national flag and by a military force. In the meantime, the second period of 10 years is fast elapsing. In 1838, the question of title will again come up, and most probably, in the present amicable state of our relations with Great Britain, will be again postponed. Every year, however, the litigated claim is growing in importance. There is no pride so jealous and irritable as the pride of territory. As one wave of immigration after another rolls into the vast regions of the West, and our settlements stretch towards the Rocky Mountains, the eager eyes of our pioneers will pry beyond, and they will become impatient of any barrier or impediment in the way of what they consider a grand outlet of our empire. Should any circumstance, therefore, unfortunately occur to disturb the present harmony of the two nations, this ill-adjusted question, which now lies dormant, may suddenly start up into one of belligerent import, and Astoria become the watchword in a contest for dominion on the shores of the Pacific. Since the above was written, the question of dominion over the vast territory beyond the Rocky Mountains, which for a time threatened to disturb the peaceful relations with our transatlantic kindred, has been finally settled in a spirit of mutual concession, and the venerable projector whose early enterprise forms the subject of this work had the satisfaction of knowing, ere his eyes closed upon the world, that the flag of his country again waved over Astoria. End of chapter 61. Appendix of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Draft of a petition to Congress sent by Mr. Astor in 1812. To the Honorable Senate and House of Representatives of the United States, in Congress assembled, the petition of the American Fur Company respectfully showeth that the trade with the several Indian tribes of North America has for many years past been almost exclusively carried on by the merchants of Canada, who, having formed powerful and extensive associations for that purpose, being aided by British capital, and being encouraged by the favor and protection of the British government, could not be opposed with any prospect of success by individuals of the United States. That by means of the above trade, thus systematically pursued, not only the inhabitants of the United States have been deprived of commercial profits and advantages, to which they appear to have just and natural pretensions, but a great and dangerous influence has been established over the Indian tribes, difficult to be counteracted, and capable of being exerted at critical periods to the great injury and annoyance of our frontier settlements. That in order to obtain at least a part of the above trade, and more particularly that which is within the boundaries of the United States, your petitioners, in the year 1808, obtained an act of incorporation from the state of New York, whereby they are enabled, with a competent capital, to carry on the said trade with the Indians in such a manner as may be conformable to the laws and regulations of the United States in relation to such a commerce. That the capital mentioned in the said act, amounting to $1,000,000, having been duly formed, your petitioners entered with zeal and alacrity into those large and important arrangements which were necessary for or conducive to the object of their incorporation, and among other things purchased a great part of the stock in trade and trading establishments of the Michilimackinac Company of Canada. Your petitioners also, with the expectation of great public and private advantages from the use of the said establishments, ordered during the spring and summer of 1810 an assortment of goods from England suitable for the Indian trade, which, in consequence of the President's proclamation of November of that year, were shipped to Canada instead of New York, and have been transported under a very heavy expense into the interior of the country. But as they could not legally be brought into the Indian country within the boundaries of the United States, they have been stored on the island of St. Joseph in Lake Huron, where they now remain. Your petitioners, with great deference and implicit submission to the wisdom of the national legislature, beg leave to suggest for consideration whether they have not some claim to national attention and encouragement from the nature and importance of their undertaking, which, though hazardous and uncertain as concerns their private emolument, must at any rate redound to the public security and advantage. If their undertaking shall appear to be of the description given, they would further suggest to your honorable bodies that unless they can procure a regular supply for the trade in which they are engaged, it may languish and be finally abandoned by American citizens, when it will revert to its former channel with additional and perhaps with irresistible power. Under these circumstances, and upon all those considerations of public policy which will present themselves to your honorable bodies, in connection with those already mentioned, your petitioners respectfully pray that a law may be passed to enable the President or any of the heads of departments acting under his authority to grant permits for the introduction of goods necessary for the supply of the Indians into the Indian country that is within the boundaries of the United States, under such regulations and with such restrictions as may secure the public revenue and promote the public welfare. And your petitioners shall ever pray, etc. In witness whereof, the common seal of the American Fur Company is hereunto affixed the day of March, 1812, by order of the corporation. An act to enable the American Fur Company and other citizens to introduce goods necessary for the Indian trade into the territories within the boundaries of the United States. Whereas the public peace and welfare require that the native Indian tribes residing within the boundaries of the United States should receive their necessary supplies under the authority and from the citizens of the United States. Therefore, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States, in Congress assembled, that it shall be lawful for the President of the United States, or any of the heads of departments thereunto by him duly authorized, from time to grant permits to the American Fur Company, their agents or factors, or any other citizens of the United States engaged in the Indian trade, to introduce into the Indian country, within the boundaries of the United States, such goods, wares, and merchandise as may be necessary for the said trade, under such regulations and restrictions as the said President or heads of departments may judge proper, any law or regulation to the contrary in any wise notwithstanding. Letter from Mr. Gallatin to Mr. Astor, New York, August 5th, 1835. Dear Sir, in compliance with your request, I will state such facts as I recollect touching the subjects mentioned in your letter of 28th ult. I may be mistaken respecting dates and details, and will only relate general facts, which I well remember. In conformity with the Treaty of 1794 with Great Britain, the citizens and subjects of each country were permitted to trade with the Indians residing in the territories of the other party. The reciprocity was altogether nominal. Since the conquest of Canada, the British had inherited from the French the whole fur trade through the Great Lakes and their communications with all the Western Indians, whether residing in the British dominions or the United States. They kept the important western posts on those lakes till about the year 1797. And the defensive Indian War, which the United States had to sustain from 1776 to 1795, had still more alienated the Indians and secured to the British their exclusive trade, carried through the lakes, wherever the Indians in that quarter lived. No American could, without imminent danger of property and life, carry on that trade, even within the United States, by the way of either Michilimackinac or St. Mary's, and independent of the loss of commerce, Great Britain was enabled to preserve a most dangerous influence over our Indians. It was under these circumstances that you communicated to our government the prospect you had to be able, and your intention, to purchase one half of the interest of the Canadian Fur Company, engaged in trade by way of Michilimackinac with our own Indians. You wished to know whether the plan met with the approbation of government, and how far you could rely on its protection and encouragement. This overture was received with great satisfaction by the administration, and Mr. Jefferson, then President, wrote you to that effect. I was also directed, as Secretary of the Treasury, to write to you an official letter to the same purpose. On investigating the subject, it was found that the executive had no authority to give you any direct aid, and I believe you received nothing more than an entire approbation of your plan, and general assurances of the protection due to every citizen engaged in lawful and useful pursuits, you did effect the contemplated purchase, but in what year I do not recollect. Immediately before the war, you represented that a large quantity of merchandise intended for the Indian trade, and including arms and munitions of war, belonging to that concern of which you owned one half, was deposited at a post on Lake Huron within the British dominions, that in order to prevent their ultimately falling into the hands of Indians who might prove hostile, you were desirous to try to have them conveyed into the United States, but that you were prevented by the then existing law of non-intercourse with the British dominions. The executive could not annul the provisions of that law, but I was directed to instruct the collectors on the lakes, in case you and your agents should voluntarily bring in and deliver to them any part of the goods above mentioned, to receive and keep them in their guard, and not to commence prosecutions until further instructions. The intention being then to apply to Congress for an act remitting the forfeiture and penalties. I wrote accordingly to that effect to the collectors of Detroit and Michilimackinac. The attempt to obtain the goods did not, however, succeed, and I cannot say how far the failure injured you, but the war proved fatal to another much more extensive and important enterprise. Previous to that time, but I also forget the year, you had undertaken to carry on a trade on your own account, though I believe under the New York charter of the American Fur Company, with the Indians west of the Rocky Mountains. This project was also communicated to government and met, of course, with its full approbation and best wishes for your success. You carried it on the most extensive scale, sending several ships to the mouth of the Columbia River and a large party by land across the mountains, and finally founding the establishment of Astoria. This unfortunately fell into the hands of the enemy during the war, from circumstances with which I am but imperfectly acquainted, being then absent on a foreign mission. I returned in September 1815 and sailed again on a mission to France in June 1816. During that period, I visited Washington twice, in October or November 1815 and in March 1816. On one of these occasions, and I believe on the last, you mentioned to me that you were disposed once more to renew the attempt and to reestablish Astoria, provided you had the protection of the American flag, for which purpose a lieutenant's command would be sufficient to you. You requested me to mention this to the President, which I did. Mr. Madison said he would consider the subject, and although he did not commit himself, I thought that he received the proposal favorably. The message was verbal, and I do not know whether the application was ever renewed in a more formal manner. I sailed soon after for Europe and was 7 years absent. I never had the pleasure since 1816 to see Mr. Madison, and never heard again anything concerning the subject in question. I remain, dear sir, most respectfully your obedient servant, Albert Gallatin. John Jacob Astor, Esquire, New York. Notices of the present state of the fur trade, chiefly extracted from an article published in Silliman's Magazine for January 1834. The Northwest Company did not long enjoy the sway they had acquired over the trading regions of the Columbia. A competition, ruinous in its expenses, which had long existed between them and the Hudson's Bay Company, ended in their downfall and the ruin of most of the partners. The relict of the company became merged in the rival association, and the whole business was conducted under the name of the Hudson's Bay Company. This coalition took place in 1821. They then abandoned Astoria and built a large establishment 60 miles up the river on the right bank, which they called Fort Vancouver. This was in a neighborhood where provisions could be more readily procured and where there was less danger from molestation by any naval force. The company are said to carry on an active and prosperous trade and to give great encouragement to settlers. They are extremely jealous, however, of any interference or participation in their trade, and monopolize it from the coast of the Pacific to the mountains, and for a considerable extent north and south. The American traders and trappers who venture across the mountains, instead of enjoying the participation in the trade of the river and its tributaries that had been stipulated by treaty, are obliged to keep to the south, out of the track of the Hudson's Bay parties. Mr. Astor has withdrawn entirely from the American Fur Company, as he has, in fact, from active business of every kind. That company is now headed by Mr. Ramsay Crooks. Its principal establishment is at Michilimackinac, and it receives its furs from the posts depending on that station, and from those on the Mississippi, Missouri, and Yellowstone rivers, and the great range of country extending thence to the Rocky Mountains. This company has steamboats in its employ, with which it ascends the rivers, and penetrates to a vast distance into the bosom of those regions formerly so painfully explored in keel boats and barges, or by weary parties on horseback and on foot. The first eruption of steamboats into the heart of these vast wildernesses is said to have caused the utmost astonishment and affright among their savage inhabitants. In addition to the main companies already mentioned, minor associations have been formed, which push their way in the most intrepid manner to the remote parts of the far west and beyond the mountain barriers. One of the most noted of these is Ashley's Company from St. Louis, who trap for themselves and drive an extensive trade with the Indians. The spirit, enterprise, and hardihood of Ashley are themes of the highest eulogy in the far west, and his adventures and exploits furnish abundance of frontier stories. Another company of 150 persons from New York, formed in 1831 and headed by Captain Bonneville of the United States Army, has pushed its enterprise into tracts before but little known, and has brought considerable quantities of furs from the region between the Rocky Mountains and the coasts of Monterey and Upper California, on the Buenaventura and Timpanogos rivers. The fur countries from the Pacific east to the Rocky Mountains are now occupied, exclusive of private combinations and individual trappers and traders, by the Russians. And on the northwest, from Bering's Strait to Queen Charlotte's Island in north latitudes 53 degrees, and by the Hudson's Bay Company thence, south of the Columbia River. While Ashley's Company, and that under Captain Bonneville, take the remainder of the region to California. Indeed, the whole compass from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean is traversed in every direction. The mountains and forests, from the Arctic Sea to the Gulf of Mexico, are threaded through every maze by the hunter. Every river and tributary stream, from the Columbia to the mouth of the Rio del Norte, and from the Mackenzie to the Colorado of the West, from their head springs to their junction, are searched and trapped for beaver. Almost all the American furs, which do not belong to the Hudson's Bay Company, find their way to New York and are either distributed thence for home consumption or sent to foreign markets. The Hudson's Bay Company ship their furs from their factories of York Fort and from Moose River on Hudson's Bay. Their collection from Grand River, etc., they ship from Canada, and the collection from Columbia goes to London. None of their furs come to the United States except through the London market. The export trade of furs from the United States is chiefly to London. Some quantities have been sent to Canton and some few to Hamburg, and an increasing export trade in beaver, otter, nutria, and vicuña wool, prepared for the hatter's use, is carried on in Mexico. Some furs are exported from Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Boston, but the principal shipments from the United States are from New York to London, from whence they are sent to Leipzig, a well-known mart for furs, where they are disposed of during the great fair in that city and distributed to every part of the continent. The United States import from South America nutria, vicuña, chinchilla, and a few deerskins, also fur skins from the Lobos Islands off the River Plate. A quantity of beaver, otter, etc. are brought annually from Santa Fe. Dressed furs for edgings, linings, caps, muffs, etc., such as squirrel, genet, fish skins, and blue rabbit, are received from the north of Europe, also coney and hare's fur, but the largest importations are from London, where is concentrated nearly the whole of the North American fur trade. Such is the present state of the fur trade, by which it will appear that the extended sway of the Hudson's Bay Company and the monopoly of the region of which Astoria was the key has operated to turn the main current of this opulent trade into the coffers of Great Britain, and to render London the emporium instead of New York, as Mr. Astor had intended. We will subjoin a few observations on the animals sought after in this traffic, extracted from the same intelligent source with the preceding remarks. Of the fur-bearing animals, the precious ermine, so called by way of preeminence, is found of the best quality only in the cold regions of Europe and Asia. Its fur is of the most perfect whiteness, except the tip of its tail, which is of a brilliant shining black. With these back tips tacked on the skins, they are beautifully spotted, producing an effect often imitated but never equaled in other furs. The ermine is of the genus Mustela, weasel, and resembles the common weasel in its form, is from 14 to 16 inches from the tip of the nose to the end of the tail. The body is from 10 to 12 inches long. It lives in hollow trees, river banks, and especially in beech forests. Preys on small birds, is very shy, sleeping during the day and employing the night in search of food. The fur of the older animals is preferred to the younger. It is taken by snares and traps, and sometimes shot with blunt arrows. Attempts have been made to domesticate it, but it is extremely wild and has been found untamable. The sable can scarcely be called second to the ermine. It is a native of northern Europe and Siberia, and is also of the genus Mustela. In Samoyeda, Yakutsk, Kamchatka, and Russian Lapland, it is found of the richest quality and darkest color. In its habits it resembles the ermine. It preys on small squirrels and birds, sleeps by day, and prowls for food during the night. It is so like the marten in every particular except its size, and the dark shade of its color, that naturalists have not decided whether it is the richest and finest of the marten tribe, or a variety of that species. It varies in dimensions from 18 to 20 inches. The rich dark shades of the sable and the snowy whiteness of the ermine, the great depth and the peculiar, almost flowing softness of their skins and fur, have combined to gain them a preference in all countries and in all ages of the world. In this age, they maintain the same relative estimate in regard to other furs as when they marked the rank of the proud crusader and were emblazoned in heraldry. But in most European nations they are now worn promiscuously by the opulent. The martens from northern Asia and the mountains of Kamchatka are much superior to the American, though in every pack of American marten skins there are a certain number which are beautifully shaded and of a dark brown olive color, of great depth and richness. Next these in value, for ornament and utility, are the sea otter, the mink, and the fiery fox. The fiery fox is the bright red of Asia, is more brilliantly colored and of finer fur than any other of the genus. It is highly valued for the splendor of its red color and the fineness of its fur. It is the standard of value on the northeastern coast of Asia. The sea otter, which was first introduced into commerce in 1725 from the Aleutian and Kuriil Islands, is an exceedingly fine, soft, close fur, jet black in winter with a silken gloss. The fur of the young animal is of a beautiful brown color. It is met with in great abundance in Bering's Island, Kamchatka, Aleutian, and Fox Islands, and is also taken on the opposite coasts of North America. It is sometimes taken with nets, but more frequently with clubs and spears. Their food is principally lobster and other shellfish. In 1780, furs had become so scarce in Siberia that the supply was insufficient for the demand in the Asiatic countries. It was at this time that the sea otter was introduced into the markets for China. The skins brought such incredible prices as to originate immediately several American and British expeditions to the northern islands of the Pacific, to Nootka Sound, and the northwest coast of America. But the Russians already had possession of the tract which they now hold, and had arranged a trade for the sea otter with the Kudak tribes. They do not engross the trade, however. The American Northwest trading ships procure them all along the coast from the Indians. At one period, the fur seals formed no inconsiderable item in the trade. South Georgia, in south latitudes of 55 degrees, discovered in 1675, was explored by Captain Cook in 1771. The Americans immediately commenced carrying seal skins thence to China, where they obtained the most exorbitant prices. 1,200,000 skins have been taken from that island alone, and nearly an equal number from the Island of Desolation. since they were first resorted to for the purpose of commerce. The discovery of the South Shetlands, 63 degrees south latitude in 1818, added surprisingly to the trade in fur seals. The number taken from the South Shetlands in 1821 and 1822 amounted to 320,000. This valuable animal is now almost extinct in all these islands, owing to the exterminating system adopted by the hunters. They are still taken in the Lobos Islands, where the provident government of Montevideo restrict the fishery or hunting within certain limits, which ensures an annual return of the seals. At certain seasons, these amphibia, for the purpose of renewing their coat, come up on the dark frowning rocks and precipices where there is not a trace of vegetation. In the middle of January, the islands are partially cleared of snow, where a few patches of short straggling grass spring up in favorable situations, but the seals do not resort to it for food. They remain on the rocks not less than 2 months, without any sustenance, when they return much emaciated to the sea. Bears of various species and colors, many varieties of the fox, the wolf, the beaver, the otter, the marten, the raccoon, the badger, the wolverine, the minx, the lynx, the muskrat, the woodchuck, the rabbit, the hare, and the squirrel, are natives of North America. The beaver, otter, lynx fisher, hare, and raccoon are used principally for hats, while the bears of several varieties furnish an excellent material for sleigh linings, for cavalry caps, and other military equipments. The fur of the black fox is the most valuable of any of the American varieties, and next to that the red, which is exported to China and Smyrna. In China, the red is employed for trimmings, linings, and robes, the latter being variegated by adding the black fur of the paws in spots or waves. There are many other varieties of American fox, such as the gray, the white, the cross, the silver, and the dun-colored. The silver fox is a rare animal, a native of the woody country below the falls of the Columbia River. It has long, thick, deep, lead-colored fur, intermingled with long hairs, invariably white at the top, forming a bright, lustrous silver-gray, esteemed by some more beautiful than any other kind of fox. The skins of the buffalo, of the Rocky Mountain sheep, of various deer, and of the antelope are included in the fur trade with the Indians and trappers of the North and West. Fox and seal skins are sent from Greenland to Denmark. The white fur of the Arctic fox and polar bear is sometimes found in the packs brought to the traders by the most northern tribes of Indians, but is not particularly valuable. The silver-tipped rabbit is peculiar to England and is sent thence to Russia and China. Other furs are employed and valued according to the caprices of fashion, as well in those countries where they are needed for defenses against the severity of the seasons, as among the inhabitants of milder climates, who, severely of Tartar or Sclavonian descent, are said to inherit an attachment to furred clothing. Such are the inhabitants of Poland, of southern Russia, of China, of Persia, of Turkey, and all the nations of Gothic origin in the middle and western parts of Europe. Under the burning suns of Syria and Egypt, and the mild climes of Bucharia and independent Tartary, there is also a constant demand and a great consumption where there exists no physical necessity. In our own temperate latitudes, besides their use in the arts, they are in request for ornament and warmth during the winter, and large quantities are annually consumed for both purposes in the United States. From the foregoing statements, it appears that the fur trade must henceforward decline. The advanced state of geographical science shows that no new countries remain to be explored. In North America, the animals are slowly decreasing, from the persevering effects and the indiscriminate slaughter practiced by the hunters, and by the appropriation to the uses of man of those forests and rivers which have afforded them food and protection. They recede with the aborigines before the tide of civilization, but a diminished supply will remain in the mountains and uncultivated tracts of this and other countries, if the avidity of the hunter can be restrained within proper limitations. Footnote: An animal called the stoat, a kind of ermine, is said to be found in North America, but very inferior to the American and Asiatic. The finest fur and darkest color are most esteemed, and whether the difference arises from the age of the animal or from some peculiarity of location is not known, they do not vary more from the common marten than the Arabian horse from the shaggy Canadian. Height of the Rocky Mountains. Various estimates have been made of the height of the Rocky Mountains, but it is doubtful whether any have as yet done justice to their real altitude, which promises to place them only second to the highest mountains of the known world. Their height has been diminished to the eye by the great elevation of the plains from which they rise. They consist, according to Long, of ridges, knobs, and peaks, variously disposed. The more elevated parts are covered with perpetual snows, which contribute to give them a luminous and, at a great distance, even a brilliant appearance, whence they derive, among some of the first discoverers, the name of the Shining Mountains. James Peak has generally been cited as the highest of the chain, and its elevation above the common level has been ascertained by a trigonometrical measurement to be about 8,500 feet. Mr. Long, however, judged from the position of the snow near the summits of other peaks and ridges at no great distance from it, that they were much higher. Having heard Professor Renwick of New York express an opinion of the altitude of these mountains far beyond what had usually been ascribed to them, we applied to him for the authority on which he grounded his observation, and here subjoin his reply. Columbia College, New York, February 23, 1836. Dear Sir, in compliance with your request, I have to communicate some facts in relation to the heights of the Rocky Mountains, and the sources whence I obtained the information. In conversation with Simon McGillivray, Esquire, a partner of the Northwest Company, he stated to me his impression that the mountains in the vicinity of the route pursued by the traders of that company were nearly as high as the Himalayas. He had himself crossed by this route, seen the snowy summits of the peaks, and experienced a degree of cold which required a spirit thermometer to indicate it. His authority for the estimate of the heights was a gentleman who had been employed for several years as surveyor of that company. This conversation occurred about 16 years since. A year or two afterwards, I had the pleasure of dining at Major Delafield's with Mr. Thompson, the gentleman referred to by Mr. McGillivray. I inquired of him in relation to the circumstances mentioned by Mr. McGillivray, and he stated that, by the joint means of the barometric and trigonometric measurement, he had ascertained the height of one of the peaks to be about 25,000 feet, and there were others of nearly the same height in the vicinity. I am, dear Sir, 2 W. Irving, Esquire, yours truly, James Renwick. Suggestions with respect to the Indian tribes and the protection of our trade. In the course of this work, a few general remarks have been hazarded respecting the Indian tribes of the prairies, and the dangers to be apprehended from them in future times to our trade beyond the Rocky Mountains, and with the Spanish frontiers. Since writing those remarks, we have met with some excellent observations and suggestions in manuscript on the same subject written by Captain Bonneville of the United States Army, who had lately returned from a long residence among the tribes of the Rocky Mountains. Captain B. approves highly of the plan recently adopted by the United States government for the organization of a regiment of dragoons for the protection of our western frontier and the trade across the prairies. No other species of military force, he observes, is at all competent to cope with these restless and wandering hordes, who require to be opposed with swiftness quite as much as with strength, and the consciousness that a troop, uniting these qualifications, is always on the alert to avenge their outrages upon the settlers and traders, will go very far towards restraining them from the perpetration of those thefts and murders which they have heretofore committed with impunity, whenever stratagem or superiority of force has given them the advantage. Their interest already has done something towards their pacification with our countrymen. From the traders among them they receive their supplies in the greatest abundance and upon very equitable terms. And when it is remembered that a very considerable amount of property is yearly distributed among them by the government as presents, it will readily be perceived that they are greatly dependent upon us for their most valued resources. If, superadded to this inducement, a frequent display of military power be made in their territories, there can be little doubt that the desired security and peace will be speedily afforded to our own people. But the idea of establishing a permanent amity and concord amongst the various East and West tribes themselves seems to me, if not wholly impracticable, at least infinitely more difficult than many excellent philanthropists have hoped and believed. Those nations which have so lately emigrated from the midst of our settlements to live upon our western borders, and have made some progress in agriculture and the arts of civilization, have, in the property they have acquired, and the protection and aid extended to them, too many advantages to be induced readily to take up arms against us, particularly if they can be brought to the full conviction that their new homes will be permanent and undisturbed, and there is every reason and motive, in policy as well as humanity, for our ameliorating their condition by every means in our power. But the case is far different with regard to the Osages, the Kansas, the Pawnees, and other roving hordes beyond the frontiers of the settlements. Wild and restless in their character and habits, they are by no means so susceptible of control or civilization, and they are urged by strong and to them irresistible causes in their situation and necessities to the daily perpetuation of violence and fraud. Their permanent subsistence, for example, is derived from the buffalo hunting grounds, which lie a great distance from their towns. Twice a year they are obliged to make long and dangerous expeditions to procure the necessary provisions for themselves and their families. For this purpose horses are absolutely requisite, for their own comfort and safety, as well as for the transportation of their food and their little stock of valuables, and without them they would be reduced, during a great portion of the year, to a state of abject misery and privation. They have no brood mares, nor any trade sufficiently valuable to supply their yearly losses, and endeavor to keep up their stock by stealing horses from the other tribes to the west and southwest. Our own people, and the tribes immediately upon our borders, may indeed be protected from their depredations, and the Kansas, Osages, Pawnees, and others may be induced to remain at peace among themselves so long as they are permitted to pursue the old custom of levying upon the Comanches and other remote nations for their complement of steeds for the warriors and pack horses for their transportation to and from the hunting ground. But the instant they are forced to maintain a peaceful and inoffensive demeanor towards the tribes along the Mexican border, and find that every violation of their rights is followed by the avenging arm of our government, the result must be that, reduced to a wretchedness and want which they can ill brook, and feeling the certainty of punishment for every attempt to ameliorate their condition in the only way they as yet comprehend, they will abandon their unfruitful territory and remove to the neighborhood of the Mexican lands, and there carry on a vigorous predatory warfare indiscriminately upon the Mexicans and our own people trading or traveling in that quarter. The Indians of the prairies are almost innumerable. Their superior horsemanship, which in my opinion far exceeds that of any other people on the face of the earth, their daring bravery, their cunning and skill in the warfare of the wilderness, and the astonishing rapidity and secrecy with which they are accustomed to move in their martial expeditions, will always render them most dangerous and vexatious neighbors, when their necessities or their discontents may drive them to hostility with our frontiers. Their mode and principles of warfare will always protect them from final and irretrievable defeat, and secure their families from participating in any blow, however severe, which our retribution might deal out to them. The Comanches lay the Mexicans under contribution for horses and mules, which they are always engaged in stealing from them in incredible numbers, and from the Comanches, all the roving tribes of the far west, by a similar exertion of skill and daring, supply themselves in turn. It seems to me, therefore, under all these circumstances, that the apparent futility of any philanthropic schemes for the benefit of these nations, and a regard for our own protection, concur in recommending that we remain satisfied with maintaining peace upon our own immediate borders, and leave the Mexicans and the Comanches, and all the tribes hostile to these last, to settle their differences and difficulties in their own way. In order to give full security and protection to our trading parties circulating in all directions through the great prairies, I am under the impression that a few judicious measures on the part of the government involving a very limited expense would be sufficient, and in attaining this end, which of itself has already become an object of public interest and import, another of much greater consequence might be brought about, namely, the securing to the States a most valuable and increasing trade, now carried on by caravans directly to Santa Fe. As to the first desideratum, the Indians can only be made to respect the lives and property of the American parties by rendering them dependent upon us for their supplies, which alone can be done with complete effect by the establishment of a trading post, with resident traders, at some point which will unite a sufficient number of advantages to attract the several tribes to itself in preference to their present places of resort for that purpose. For it is a well-known fact that the Indians will always protect their trader, and those in whom he is interested, so long as they derive benefits from him. The alternative presented to those at the north by the residence of the agents of the Hudson's Bay Company amongst them renders the condition of our people in that quarter less secure. But I think it will appear at once, upon the most cursory examination, that no such opposition further south could be maintained so as to weaken the benefits of such an establishment as is here suggested. In considering this matter, the first question which presents itself is, where do these tribes now make their exchanges and obtain their necessary supplies? They resort almost exclusively to the Mexicans, who themselves purchase from us whatever the Indians most seek for. In this point of view, therefore, coeteris paribus, it would be an easy matter for us to monopolize the whole traffic. All that is wanted is some location more convenient for the natives than that offered by the Mexicans, to give us the undisputed superiority, and the selection of such a point requires but a knowledge of the single fact that these nations invariably winter upon the headwaters of the Arkansas, and there prepare all their buffalo robes for trade. These robes are heavy, and to the Indians very difficult of transportation. Nothing but necessity induces them to travel any great distance with such inconvenient baggage. A post, therefore, established upon the headwaters of the Arkansas, must infallibly secure an uncontested preference over that of the Mexicans, even at their prices and rates of barter. Then let the dragoons occasionally move about among these people in large parties, impressing them with a proper estimate of our power to protect and to punish, and at once we have complete and assured security for all citizens whose enterprise may lead them beyond the border, and an end to the outrages and depredations which now dog the footsteps of the traveler in the prairies, and arrest and depress the most advantageous commerce. Such a post need not be stronger than 50 men, 25 to be employed as hunters to supply the garrison, and the residue as a defense against any hostility. Situated here upon the good lands of the Arkansas, in the midst of abundance of timber, while it might be kept up at a most inconsiderable expense, such an establishment within 90 miles of Santa Fe or Taos would be more than justified by the other and more important advantages before alluded to, leaving the protection of the traders with the Indian tribes entirely out of the question. This great trade, carried on by caravans to Santa Fe, annually loads 100 wagons with merchandise, which is bartered in the northern provinces or Mexico for cash and for beaver furs. The numerous articles excluded as contraband and the exorbitant duties laid upon all those that are admitted by the Mexican government present so many obstacles to commerce that I am well persuaded that if a post, such as is here suggested, should be established on the Arkansas, it would become the place of deposit not only for the present trade, but for one infinitely more extended. Here the Mexicans might purchase their supplies, and might well afford to sell them at prices which would silence all competition from any other quarter. These two trades, with the Mexicans and the Indians, centering at this post, would give rise to large villages of traders and laborers, and would undoubtedly be hailed by all that section of country as a permanent and invaluable advantage. A few pack horses would carry all the clothing and ammunition necessary for the post during the first year, and 2 light field pieces would be all the artillery required for its defense. Afterwards, all the horses required for the use of the establishment might be purchased from the Mexicans at the low price of $10 each, and at the same time whatever animals might be needed to supply the losses among the dragoons traversing the neighborhood could be readily procured. The upper Missouri Indians can furnish horses at very cheap rates to any number of the same troops who might be detailed for the defense of the northern frontier, and in other respects a very limited outlay of money would suffice to maintain a post in that section of the country. From these considerations and my own personal observations, I am therefore disposed to believe that 2 posts established by the government, one at the mouth of the Yellowstone River and one on the Arkansas, would completely protect all our people in every section of the great wilderness of the West, while other advantages, at least with regard to one of them, confirm and urge the suggestion. A fort at the mouth of the Yellowstone, garrisoned by 50 men, would be perfectly safe. The establishment might be constructed simply with a view to the stores, stables for the dragoons' horses, and quarters for the regular garrison, the rest being provided with sheds or lodges erected in the vicinity for their residence during the winter months. End of Appendix. End of Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains by Washington Irving. Recording by Carol Pelster.